Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sleep Detective. Tonight we embark on perhaps our most disturbing psychological journey yet into the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal. Over the next couple of hours, we'll explore not just the horrific crimes that shocked the world, but the complex psychology that drove a seemingly quiet man to commit acts so heinous they challenged our understanding of human nature itself. This isn't about sensationalizing evil, but about understanding the psychological mechanisms that can transform isolation and mental illness into unthinkable violence. Before we begin this comprehensive exploration into one of criminal psychology's most complex cases, let me know in the comments what draws you to these deep psychological analyses. There's something both terrifying and necessary about trying to understand minds that operate so far outside normal human experience. If you find value in these detailed psychological journeys, subscribing helps us continue exploring the darkest corners of human psychology. Tonight's analysis will take us through childhood isolation, the development of necrophilic fantasies, and the gradual descent into cannibalism and murder. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to parents whose troubled marriage would create the unstable foundation for his psychological development. From the very beginning, Jeffrey's childhood was marked by emotional neglect and family dysfunction that would profoundly impact his ability to form normal human connections. His mother, Joyce, suffered from severe mental health issues and was frequently hospitalized, while his father, Lionel, buried himself in work to escape the chaos at home, leaving Jeffrey emotionally abandoned during crucial developmental years. The psychology of childhood emotional neglect reveals how the absence of consistent, nurturing relationships can severely impact a child's developing sense of self and their ability to connect with others. For Jeffrey, the lack of stable emotional bonds during his formative years created what psychologists call attachment disorder, a fundamental inability to form healthy relationships with other human beings. This early emotional wound would become the foundation for all of his later psychological problems and criminal behavior. Jeffrey's earliest signs of psychological disturbance appeared around age 4, when he began showing unusual fascination with dead animals and roadkill. He would collect deceased creatures, examine their internal structures, and even preserve parts of them in jars filled with chemicals. This morbid curiosity wasn't typical childhood exploration, but revealed early signs of what psychologists call thanatophilia, an abnormal attraction to death and dead objects that would later evolve into much more disturbing behaviors. The psychological significance of Jeffrey's animal experimentation cannot be overstated. His systematic dissection of roadkill and his attempts to preserve animal remains show early manifestations of the control and possession needs that would later drive his crimes against human victims. He was learning to exercise power over death itself, finding in deceased animals the companionship and control that he couldn't achieve with living beings. This early behavior pattern established templates for later criminal activities. Jeffrey's family dynamics deteriorated further during his elementary school years as his parents' marriage became increasingly unstable and violent. The constant fighting, emotional volatility, and threat of abandonment created a home environment where Jeffrey learned that relationships were sources of pain rather than comfort. His psychological response was to withdraw further into himself, developing elaborate internal fantasy worlds that provided the emotional connection and control that his real relationships lacked. The psychology of Jeffrey's social isolation during childhood reveals how early rejection and inability to connect with peers can create self-reinforcing cycles of loneliness and resentment. His classmates described him as weird and off-putting, leading to social rejection that confirmed his internal beliefs about his fundamental difference from other people. This rejection drove him deeper into solitary activities and internal fantasies, further impairing his already limited social development. Jeffrey's discovery of his homosexuality during early adolescence added another layer of psychological complexity to his already troubled development. Growing up in a conservative household and community during the 1970s, his sexual orientation became another source of shame and isolation. The combination of his existing psychological problems with the additional stress of sexual identity confusion created overwhelming internal pressure that he had no healthy way to process or resolve. The psychological impact of Jeffrey's father's absence during crucial developmental periods cannot be understated. Lionel Dahmer's emotional unavailability and physical absence left Jeffrey without positive male role models or guidance during adolescence. This abandonment reinforced Jeffrey's beliefs about the unreliability of human relationships while depriving him of the support he desperately needed to navigate his emerging psychological problems and sexual identity issues. Jeffrey's academic performance during high school reflected his deteriorating psychological state. Despite above-average intelligence, his grades declined as he became increasingly withdrawn and began experimenting with alcohol as a means of emotional escape. His drinking wasn't typical teenage experimentation, but represented early self-medication for underlying psychological pain and social anxiety that he had no other way to manage or express to others. The psychology of Jeffrey's high school years reveals the development of what would become lifelong patterns of using substances to manage emotional distress and social anxiety. His heavy drinking served multiple psychological functions. It numbed emotional pain, reduced social inhibitions that made interaction with others difficult, and provided temporary escape from the overwhelming internal pressure created by his unresolved psychological conflicts and growing violent fantasies. Jeffrey's first known criminal act occurred during his senior year of high school when he began following and stalking male joggers, planning to assault them with a baseball bat. Although he never carried out these attacks, the planning and stalking behavior reveal the emergence of predatory thinking and the beginning of his transition from fantasy to action. These rehearsal behaviors show how his violent thoughts were beginning to organize into specific plans and behaviors. The psychological significance of Jeffrey's targeting of male victims reveals the intersection of his sexual orientation with his need for control and possession. His victims weren't random, but represented specific psychological needs related to his sexual identity, his desire for companionship, and his overwhelming need to exercise complete control over other human beings. This targeting pattern would remain consistent throughout his criminal career. Jeffrey's graduation from high school marked a crucial transition period where his psychological problems began manifesting in increasingly serious ways. Without the structure of school or positive social connections, he became increasingly isolated and dependent on alcohol, while his violent fantasies became more elaborate and specific. This period represents the psychological bridge between troubled adolescence and active criminal behavior. The psychology of Jeffrey's early adulthood reveals someone whose fundamental inability to form normal relationships was driving him toward increasingly desperate attempts to create the human connections he craved. His fantasies began focusing on the idea of having completely compliant partners who couldn't reject or abandon him, a psychological need that would eventually lead to his first murder and the beginning of his horrific criminal career. Jeffrey's first kill occurred just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, when he picked up hitchhiker Stephen Hicks and murdered him at his family's home. The psychological significance of this timing suggests that the transition to adult independence triggered a psychological crisis that his existing coping mechanisms couldn't handle. The murder represented his first attempt to resolve his overwhelming need for companionship through complete control over another person. The psychology of Jeffrey's first murder reveals patterns that would characterize all of his subsequent crimes. He killed Stephen Hicks not in a moment of rage or passion, but because Hicks wanted to leave, threatening Jeffrey with the abandonment and rejection that he couldn't psychologically tolerate. This murder was fundamentally about control and possession rather than simple violence, establishing the psychological template for his entire criminal career. Jeffrey's behavior after his first murder shows the beginning of the psychological patterns that would define his approach to his crimes. He dismembered the body, attempted to dissolve the remains in acid, and scattered the bones throughout his property. This systematic approach to body disposal reveals someone who was treating murder as a problem to be solved rather than a traumatic event to be processed emotionally. The 9-year gap between Jeffrey's first murder and his second reveals the psychological impact of successfully crossing the threshold from fantasy to reality. During this period, he attempted to live a normal life through military service and college attendance, but his fundamental psychological problems remained unresolved. The first murder had proven that he could kill and get away with it, creating psychological permission for future crimes when his other coping mechanisms failed. Jeffrey's military service provided temporary structure and distraction from his psychological problems, but ultimately failed to address his underlying issues. His drinking continued, his social isolation persisted, and his sexual fantasies became increasingly violent and specific. The military experience demonstrated that external structure alone couldn't resolve the deep psychological problems that were driving his behavior. The psychology of Jeffrey's college period reveals someone who was desperately trying to live a normal life while being increasingly consumed by violent sexual fantasies. His academic failure and continued social isolation showed that his psychological problems were becoming more severe and resistant to conventional solutions. This period represents his last serious attempt to pursue a normal life before fully embracing his criminal psychology. Jeffrey's return to Milwaukee and the beginning of his active killing career in 1987 marked the point where his psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. The combination of ongoing family dysfunction, social isolation, and unresolved psychological conflicts created conditions where murder became his primary method of achieving the human connection and control that he craved but couldn't obtain through normal relationships. The psychological analysis of Jeffrey's transition from isolated individual to active serial killer reveals how multiple factors, childhood trauma, social rejection, substance abuse, and unresolved sexual identity issues can combine to create conditions where violence becomes the only perceived solution to overwhelming psychological needs. Understanding this development process is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in others before they reach the point of irreversible criminal behavior. As we examine Jeffrey Dahmer's early psychological development, we see how a combination of genetic predisposition, environmental factors, and early trauma can create the foundation for extreme antisocial behavior. His case demonstrates how childhood emotional neglect and social isolation can impair normal psychological development in ways that have devastating consequences for both the individual and their future victims. The psychological journey we've begun tonight reveals how seemingly minor early signs of disturbance can evolve into catastrophic criminal behavior when left unaddressed. Jeffrey's progression from childhood animal experimentation to adult murder shows how psychological problems can escalate over time, developing into patterns that become increasingly resistant to intervention or change. Understanding Jeffrey Dahmer's early psychology challenges us to recognize the crucial importance of early intervention when signs of severe psychological disturbance appear in childhood and adolescence. His case provides a roadmap for understanding how emotional neglect, social isolation, and untreated mental health issues can combine to create the conditions for extreme violence against innocent victims. The mind we've begun to explore tonight represents one of the most disturbing examples of how human psychology can develop along fundamentally abnormal lines. Jeffrey Dahmer's early development shows how the absence of normal emotional connections can create psychological voids that become filled with violence, control, and ultimately murder. As we continue our journey, we'll see how these early patterns evolved into one of criminal history's most horrific killing careers. The foundation has been laid for understanding how Jeffrey Dahmer became the monster he would ultimately become. The psychological patterns we've identified tonight, the emotional neglect, social isolation, early fascination with death, and inability to form normal relationships created the framework for everything that would follow. In our next segment, we'll explore how these early problems evolved into the specific fantasies and behaviors that would drive his crimes against 17 innocent victims. As we continue our psychological exploration into Jeffrey Dahmer's mind, we now examine one of the most disturbing aspects of his pathology: the development and evolution of his necrophilic fantasies. Understanding how his sexual psychology became intertwined with death and control provides crucial insights into the mechanisms that drove his horrific crimes. This isn't just about sexual deviance, but about how profound psychological isolation and attachment disorders can corrupt the most basic human needs for intimacy and connection into something monstrous and deadly. The psychology of necrophilia represents one of the most extreme forms of sexual pathology, involving sexual attraction to corpses and dead bodies. For Jeffrey, this attraction wasn't simply a sexual preference, but a complex psychological solution to his fundamental inability to form relationships with living people. Dead bodies provided him with the complete control and lack of rejection that his damaged psychology required, while satisfying his desperate need for physical and emotional intimacy. Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies began developing during his late teens, initially manifesting as elaborate daydreams about having complete control over unconscious or helpless partners. These fantasies served multiple psychological functions. They provided sexual gratification, satisfied his need for control, and offered imaginary solutions to his overwhelming fear of rejection and abandonment. The progression from fantasies about unconscious people to actual attraction to corpses represents a gradual psychological escalation toward increasingly extreme solutions. The psychological origins of Jeffrey's necrophilic attraction can be traced to his early experiences with dead animals and his fascination with their internal structures. His childhood experiments with roadkill and animal remains provided early templates for associating death with curiosity, control, and a form of companionship. These early experiences created psychological pathways that would later be activated and intensified during his sexual development in adolescence. Jeffrey's fantasies evolved to include elaborate scenarios where he could keep partners forever without fear of abandonment or rejection. The psychological appeal of these fantasies lay not just in their sexual content, but in their promise of permanent companionship and absolute control. For someone whose entire life had been marked by rejection and isolation, the idea of having partners who couldn't leave became powerfully attractive and emotionally necessary. The psychology of how Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies became sexualized reveals the intersection of his attachment disorders with his developing sexual identity. His inability to form normal emotional bonds meant that his sexual development occurred in psychological isolation, without the normal social learning that helps most people develop healthy sexual relationships. This isolation allowed his fantasies to develop along increasingly pathological lines without external correction or modification. Jeffrey's first attempts to act on his fantasies occurred during his high school years, when he began visiting morgues and funeral homes, seeking opportunities to be near dead bodies. These visits weren't random, but represented careful planning and psychological preparation for more serious criminal behavior. The fact that he was actively seeking out corpses during adolescence shows how completely his sexual psychology had become focused on death and control. The psychological significance of Jeffrey's morgue visits reveals someone whose fantasy life had become so compelling that he was willing to take significant risks to experience even limited contact with actual corpses. These visits provided validation for his fantasies while gradually desensitizing him to the reality of death and dead bodies. Each visit made the next step toward actual murder psychologically easier and more acceptable. Jeffrey's necrophilic psychology wasn't just about sexual attraction to corpses, but encompassed a complete worldview where death represented the ultimate form of possession and control. In his twisted thinking, killing someone wasn't just murder, but a form of love that ensured permanent companionship without the possibility of rejection or abandonment. This psychological framework allowed him to rationalize his crimes as expressions of affection rather than violence. The psychology of Jeffrey's sexual development reveals how social isolation and attachment disorders can corrupt normal sexual drives into pathological obsessions. His complete lack of normal sexual relationships meant that his sexual psychology developed entirely through fantasy and solitary experience, allowing increasingly extreme ideas to become normalized and integrated into his core identity. This isolation prevented the reality testing that might have modified his developing pathology. Jeffrey's fantasies began incorporating specific scenarios of how he could create compliant partners through various means, including drugging, surgery, and ultimately murder. These detailed mental rehearsals served as psychological preparation for his actual crimes, allowing him to work through logistical problems and emotional barriers before attempting real attacks. The specificity and detail of these fantasies reveals extensive psychological planning and preparation. The psychological evolution of Jeffrey's fantasies from simple necrophilic attraction to elaborate scenarios of creating zombie-like slaves reveals escalating needs for control and possession. His later experiments with drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting acid into their brains were direct implementations of fantasies he had been developing for years. This shows how fantasy and reality became increasingly merged in his psychological world. Jeffrey's necrophilic psychology included strong elements of preservation and collection, reflecting his need to maintain permanent possession of his victims. His attempts to preserve body parts, create shrines from bones and skulls, and keep photographic records all stemmed from psychological needs to extend and maintain his control over victims beyond their deaths. These behaviors show how his pathology encompassed not just killing, but ongoing possession. The psychology of how Jeffrey's fantasies influenced his approach to actual crimes reveals someone whose reality had become completely organized around pathological sexual needs. His selection of victims, his methods of approach, and his post-murder behaviors were all designed to fulfill specific fantasy scenarios that had been developing in his mind for years. The crimes weren't impulsive, but represented careful implementation of long-standing psychological plans. Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies also included elements of cannibalism, which he viewed as the ultimate form of possession and incorporation of his victims into himself. This psychological progression from necrophilia to cannibalism represents an escalation in his need for control and connection, where simply having sex with corpses was no longer sufficient to satisfy his psychological requirements for possession and intimacy. The psychology of Jeffrey's cannibalistic fantasies reveals someone who was seeking literal incorporation of his victims into his own body as a solution to his profound loneliness and isolation. In his twisted thinking, consuming parts of his victims would allow him to maintain their presence within himself permanently, creating the intimate connection he craved but couldn't achieve through normal relationships. This represents one of the most extreme forms of psychological possession possible. Jeffrey's sexual psychology became increasingly organized around death and control as his social isolation deepened during his early 20s. His failed attempts at normal relationships and his continued rejection by potential partners reinforced his belief that only dead partners could provide the acceptance and permanence he needed. This psychological conclusion made murder seem like a reasonable solution to his relationship problems. The psychological development of Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies was accelerated by his heavy alcohol use, which reduced his inhibitions and allowed him to explore increasingly extreme ideas without normal psychological barriers. Alcohol didn't create his pathology, but removed the internal controls that might have prevented his fantasies from progressing toward actual criminal behavior. This shows how substance abuse can interact with mental illness to produce dangerous escalations. Jeffrey's fantasies evolved to include detailed scenarios of how he would transform his living space into environments suitable for his necrophilic activities. His later apartment modifications, including the altar of skulls and bones, the freezer full of body parts, and the chemical equipment for dissolving remains, were all direct implementations of fantasies he had been developing for years. This shows how extensively his pathology had infected his entire life and worldview. The psychology of how Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies became integrated with his daily routine reveals someone whose entire existence had become organized around pathological sexual needs. His work schedule, living arrangements, and social activities were all planned to accommodate and facilitate his criminal activities. This complete integration shows how thoroughly his pathology had taken over his psychology and behavior. Jeffrey's sexual fantasies also included elements of total domination and control that went beyond simple necrophilia to encompass complete ownership of other human beings. His experiments with creating lobotomized slaves and his elaborate preservation rituals were attempts to achieve levels of control over other people that are impossible in normal relationships. This reveals the depth of his control obsessions and possession needs. The psychological progression of Jeffrey's fantasies from necrophilia to murder reveals how sexual pathology can escalate when fueled by social isolation and untreated mental illness. His movement from fantasizing about corpses to actually creating corpses represents a fundamental shift in his relationship with reality and his willingness to harm others to satisfy his psychological needs. Understanding Jeffrey's necrophilic psychology helps explain the particular horror of his crimes and the complete breakdown of normal human empathy that made them possible. His sexual attraction to death and corpses created psychological incentives for murder that made killing not just acceptable but desirable in his twisted worldview. This understanding is crucial for recognizing similar patterns in other cases. The sexual pathology we've examined tonight represents one of the most extreme forms of psychological deviation possible, showing how early trauma and social isolation can corrupt basic human drives into something monstrous. Jeffrey's necrophilic fantasies weren't just sexual preferences, but comprehensive psychological solutions to profound emotional problems that he couldn't resolve through normal means. The evolution of Jeffrey's dark fantasies reveals how mental illness can progress over time when left untreated, developing into increasingly extreme and dangerous patterns. His case shows how sexual pathology can become integrated with violence and control needs to create psychological systems that inevitably lead to criminal behavior and harm to innocent victims. As we continue our exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology, understanding his necrophilic fantasies provides crucial context for examining his actual crimes and the psychological needs they were designed to fulfill. The fantasies we've analyzed tonight became the blueprint for a killing career that would claim 17 innocent lives and shock the world with its depravity. The psychological journey into Jeffrey's sexual pathology reveals how the most basic human needs for connection and intimacy can be corrupted by trauma and isolation into drives that lead to murder and destruction. His necrophilic fantasies represent the ultimate perversion of love and connection, showing how damaged minds can transform the desire for closeness into justifications for the most heinous crimes imaginable. In our next segment, we'll examine how these fantasies translated into actual criminal behavior, exploring the psychology of Jeffrey's first murders and how his pathological needs evolved from fantasy into the horrific reality that would terrorize Milwaukee and shock the nation. The foundation of sexual pathology we've explored tonight provides the framework for understanding the crimes that would follow. As our psychological exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer continues, we now examine one of the most crucial moments in his criminal development, his first murder. The killing of Stephen Hicks in 1978 represents a psychological threshold that, once crossed, fundamentally altered Jeffrey's relationship with violence and death. Understanding the psychology behind this first murder reveals how fantasies transform into reality and how the act of killing can become psychologically addictive for individuals with severe personality disorders. This wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but the culmination of years of psychological preparation and escalating pathology. The psychology of first murders and serial killing cases reveals patterns that distinguish these crimes from later, more sophisticated killings. Jeffrey's murder of Stephen Hicks occurred just 3 weeks after his high school graduation, during a period of significant psychological stress and transition. The timing suggests that the loss of structure and the prospect of adult independence triggered a psychological crisis that his existing coping mechanisms couldn't handle, making murder seem like a viable solution to his overwhelming emotional needs. Jeffrey's encounter with Stephen Hicks began as what appeared to be a normal social interaction. He offered the young hitchhiker a ride and invited him back to his house for drinks and marijuana. The psychology behind this approach reveals Jeffrey's desperate need for human companionship combined with his complete inability to sustain normal social relationships. The offer of hospitality masked deeper psychological needs for control and permanent possession that couldn't be satisfied through conventional social interaction. The psychological significance of Jeffrey's choice to target a young male hitchhiker reveals the intersection of his sexual orientation with his need for control and possession. Stephen Hicks represented everything Jeffrey desired but felt he couldn't have through normal means: youth, attractiveness, and the potential for intimacy. The fact that Hicks was vulnerable due to his hitchhiking situation made him an ideal target for someone seeking easy control over another person. Jeffrey's decision to murder Stephen Hicks wasn't made in a moment of sudden rage but developed gradually during their interaction as it became clear that Hicks wanted to leave. The psychology of this decision-making process reveals someone whose entire sense of self-worth was tied to maintaining control over others. When Hicks expressed his desire to leave, it triggered Jeffrey's deepest fears of abandonment and rejection, making murder seem like the only way to prevent another devastating loss. The actual murder of Stephen Hicks was accomplished using a barbell as a weapon, striking the victim in the head while his back was turned. The psychology of this method reveals someone who was psychologically prepared for violence but still needed the element of surprise to overcome a potentially stronger opponent. The use of an improvised weapon suggests that while Jeffrey was psychologically ready to kill, he hadn't yet developed the sophisticated planning that would characterize his later crimes. Jeffrey's immediate psychological response to committing his first murder reveals patterns that would characterize his approach to all subsequent killings. Rather than experiencing guilt, remorse, or panic that would be normal for someone who had just committed murder, Jeffrey reported feeling a sense of satisfaction and completion. This abnormal response shows the depth of his psychological pathology and his complete disconnection from normal human emotional responses to violence. The psychology of Jeffrey's post-murder behavior with Stephen Hicks' body reveals how his necrophilic fantasies immediately translated into reality once the barrier to murder had been crossed. He engaged in sexual activity with the corpse, fulfilling fantasies that had been developing for years. This immediate sexualization of his victim's death shows how completely his sexual psychology had become organized around death and control. Jeffrey's systematic dismemberment of Stephen Hicks' body reveals psychological patterns that would remain consistent throughout his criminal career. The careful cutting apart of the corpse wasn't done in panic or haste but represented methodical implementation of plans he had been developing through fantasy for years. This systematic approach shows how thoroughly he had mentally prepared for this moment and how quickly fantasy became integrated with reality. The psychology of Jeffrey's attempts to dispose of Stephen Hicks' remains reveals both sophisticated planning and fundamental psychological conflicts about his actions. His initial attempts to bury the body parts, followed by later exhumation and further dismemberment, show someone who was simultaneously trying to hide evidence and maintain possession of his victim. This conflict between concealment and possession would characterize many of his later crimes. Jeffrey's use of acid to dissolve Stephen Hicks' flesh and his scattering of bone fragments throughout his property reveals psychological needs that went beyond simple body disposal. These elaborate destruction rituals served multiple psychological functions. They eliminated evidence, extended his control over the victim, and provided ongoing interaction with the remains. The time and effort invested in these activities shows how psychologically important they were to his overall satisfaction with the crime. The 9-year gap between Jeffrey's first murder and his second killing provides crucial insights into the psychological impact of successfully crossing the murder threshold. During this period, he attempted to live a relatively normal life through military service and college attendance, but the knowledge that he had killed and gotten away with it remained a constant presence in his psychology. This successful murder had proven that his fantasies could become reality, creating psychological permission for future crimes. The psychology of Jeffrey's behavior during the 9-year gap reveals someone who was simultaneously trying to suppress his criminal impulses while being gradually consumed by them. His continued heavy drinking, social isolation, and deteriorating performance in military and academic settings all show the psychological toll of maintaining his secret while struggling with urges to repeat his crime. This internal conflict demonstrates how the act of murder can become psychologically addictive even when consciously resisted. Jeffrey's military service provided temporary structure and distraction from his psychological problems, but ultimately failed to address the underlying issues that had led to murder. His continued alcohol abuse and social isolation during this period show that external structure alone couldn't resolve the deep psychological problems driving his behavior. The military experience represented his last serious attempt to live a normal life before fully embracing his criminal psychology. The psychology of Jeffrey's college period reveals someone who was desperately trying to pursue conventional goals while being increasingly consumed by memories of his first murder and fantasies about repeating it. His academic failure and social withdrawal during this time show that his psychological energy was being directed toward internal conflicts rather than external achievements. This period represents the gradual breakdown of his attempts to maintain a normal facade. Jeffrey's eventual return to Milwaukee and resumption of killing in 1987 marked the point where his psychological defenses finally collapsed completely. The combination of ongoing family dysfunction, personal failures, and the unresolved psychological satisfaction from his first murder created conditions where killing became his primary method of coping with life stress and achieving the control and intimacy he craved. The psychological analysis of how Jeffrey's first murder influenced his later criminal development reveals the addictive nature of violence for individuals with severe personality disorders. The successful completion of his fantasy through the murder of Stephen Hicks created neural pathways and psychological patterns that made subsequent murders both easier and more psychologically necessary. This demonstrates how crossing the murder threshold can fundamentally alter an individual's relationship with violence. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's first murder helps explain how seemingly isolated acts of violence can become the foundation for extended criminal careers. His case shows how the psychological satisfaction derived from murder can create powerful reinforcement that drives escalating criminal behavior over time. This understanding is crucial for recognizing when isolated violent incidents may represent the beginning of more extensive criminal patterns. The transformation we see in Jeffrey following his first murder reveals how the act of killing can serve as a form of psychological initiation that fundamentally changes an individual's self-image and relationship with society. After proving to himself that he could kill and get away with it, Jeffrey's psychology shifted from someone who fantasized about violence to someone who had successfully implemented those fantasies in reality. The psychological impact of successfully committing murder without consequences created what experts call criminal confidence, the belief that he was too smart or too careful to ever be caught. This confidence would influence all of his subsequent crimes and contribute to the increasingly bold and risky behavior that would eventually lead to his capture. Understanding this psychological progression helps explain how serial killers often escalate their activities over time. Jeffrey's first murder also established the psychological template that would guide all of his subsequent crimes. The use of deception to gain victim compliance, the sexual utilization of corpses, the systematic dismemberment of remains, and the elaborate disposal rituals. These patterns weren't developed gradually, but appeared fully formed in his very first crime, showing how completely his fantasies had prepared him for the reality of murder. The psychology of crossing the murder threshold that we've examined tonight reveals how the transition from fantasy to reality represents a fundamental point of no return in criminal psychology. Once Jeffrey had proven to himself that he could kill, the psychological barriers that had previously constrained his behavior were permanently removed, making future murders not just possible, but psychologically inevitable. Understanding Jeffrey Dahmer's first murder provides crucial insights into how seemingly normal individuals can cross the line into extreme violence when driven by severe psychological pathology. His case demonstrates how years of fantasy development and psychological preparation can culminate in a moment of decision that changes everything, transforming someone from a troubled individual into an active predator. The psychological analysis of this crucial threshold moment in Jeffrey's development reveals patterns that are common among serial killers but rarely documented with such clarity. His case provides a roadmap for understanding how the transition from thought to action occurs and how the psychological consequences of that transition can drive continued criminal behavior over extended periods. As we continue our exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology, understanding his first murder provides the foundation for examining his later crimes and the escalating patterns of violence that would eventually claim 16 more innocent lives. The threshold we've examined tonight was crossed in 1978, but its psychological consequences would echo through the next 13 years of increasingly horrific criminal behavior. As our psychological journey through Jeffrey Dahmer's mind continues, we now examine the most horrific period of his criminal career, the systematic killing spree that terrorized Milwaukee from 1987 to 1991. During this 4-year period, Jeffrey murdered 16 men and boys, refining his techniques and escalating his depravity with each crime. Understanding the psychology behind this systematic approach to murder reveals how his pathological needs evolved into an efficient killing machine that operated with terrifying precision and escalating sadism. The psychology of Jeffrey's transition from isolated first murder to systematic serial killing reveals how successful crime can create powerful psychological reinforcement that drives escalating behavior. The 9-year gap between his first and second murders had allowed his fantasies to develop and intensify, while his successful concealment of Stephen Hicks' murder provided confidence that he could kill repeatedly without detection. This combination of psychological preparation and criminal confidence created ideal conditions for a sustained killing spree. Jeffrey's second murder, that of Stephen Twomey in November 1987, marked the beginning of his systematic killing phase and revealed important psychological evolution in his methods. Unlike his first murder, which occurred at his family home, this killing took place in a hotel room, showing his growing confidence in his ability to control crime scenes and dispose of evidence. The choice of location also reflects his psychological need to separate his killing activities from his daily living space. The psychology of Jeffrey's victim selection during his Milwaukee period reveals sophisticated understanding of vulnerability and opportunity combined with specific sexual and psychological preferences. He targeted young men at gay bars and bathhouses, understanding that these venues provided access to victims who were already isolated from family support systems and whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. This targeting strategy shows calculated predatory thinking designed to minimize investigation while maximizing victim availability. Jeffrey's approach methods during this period reveal psychological manipulation techniques that had been refined through years of practice and observation. He would present himself as friendly and non-threatening, offering money for photographs or companionship, and using alcohol and drugs to incapacitate his victims. This systematic approach shows someone who had learned to weaponize normal social interactions and hospitality to gain victim compliance and control. The psychology of Jeffrey's apartment setup reveals how completely his living space had been organized around his criminal activities. His apartment at 924 North 25th Street became a carefully designed killing and processing facility, with chemical equipment for dissolving remains, refrigeration for preserving body parts, and altar-like displays of skulls and bones. This transformation of domestic space into a charnel house shows how thoroughly his pathology had consumed his entire existence. Jeffrey's killing method during this period typically involved drugging victims with sedatives dissolved in alcoholic drinks, then strangling them while they were unconscious. This approach served multiple psychological functions. It allowed him to maintain control throughout the process, minimized victim resistance and suffering, and ensured that his victims died in a state that resembled sleep. The psychological appeal of this method relates to his fantasy of having completely passive, compliant partners. The psychology of Jeffrey's post-murder rituals reveals escalating needs for possession and control that went far beyond simple killing. His systematic photographing of each stage of dismemberment, his preservation of body parts in freezers and chemical solutions, and his creation of trophy collections all show someone whose psychological satisfaction came as much from ongoing possession of victims as from the act of killing itself. Jeffrey's evolution toward cannibalism during this period represents one of the most extreme escalations in his psychological pathology. His consumption of victims' flesh wasn't driven by hunger, but by psychological needs for ultimate possession and incorporation. In his twisted thinking, eating parts of his victims allowed him to literally make them part of himself, creating the permanent connection and control that his damaged psychology craved above all else. The psychology of Jeffrey's preservation techniques reveals sophisticated planning and a scientific approach to maintaining his victim collections. His use of chemicals, freezing, and various preservation methods shows someone who was treating human remains like museum specimens or scientific specimens. This clinical approach to human bodies demonstrates the complete dehumanization that characterized his psychology and enabled his continued criminal behavior. Jeffrey's attempts to create zombie-like slaves through drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting acid into their brains represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his psychological evolution. These experiments weren't random acts of sadism, but systematic attempts to create the completely compliant companions that his psychology required. The fact that he continued these experiments despite their obvious failure shows how completely disconnected from reality his thinking had become. The psychology of Jeffrey's escalating frequency of murders during this period reveals addiction-like patterns where each killing provided temporary satisfaction that quickly faded, requiring more frequent crimes to maintain psychological equilibrium. By 1991, he was killing almost monthly, showing how his tolerance for normal psychological states had been completely destroyed by his criminal activities. Jeffrey's increasingly bold behavior during this period, including bringing victims to his apartment in broad daylight and disposing of remains in dumpsters near his building, reveals psychological changes brought on by repeated successful crimes. His growing confidence and contempt for law enforcement led to increasingly risky behavior that would eventually contribute to his capture, showing how criminal success can paradoxically lead to self-destructive overconfidence. The psychology of Jeffrey's relationship with his neighbors during this period reveals his sophisticated ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while conducting horrific crimes just feet away. His interactions with other apartment residents were carefully calculated to appear normal and unremarkable, demonstrating the psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to function in society while committing increasingly frequent murders. Jeffrey's use of various chemicals and equipment for dismemberment and disposal reveals someone who had developed considerable expertise in body destruction and concealment. His knowledge of acids, his improvised cutting tools, and his systematic approach to evidence destruction all show someone who was treating murder as a technical problem requiring innovative solutions. This clinical approach demonstrates the complete emotional detachment that characterized his psychology. The psychology of Jeffrey's trophy-taking behavior escalated dramatically during this period as he began keeping increasingly elaborate collections of victim remains. His skull shrine, his preserved genitals, and his photographic records all serve to extend his psychological possession of victims long after their deaths. These collections became the focal points of his daily life, providing ongoing satisfaction and reinforcement for his criminal behavior. Jeffrey's experiments with different killing methods and post-mortem activities reveal someone who was constantly seeking to perfect his crimes and maximize his psychological satisfaction. His variations in approach, his different preservation techniques, and his escalating sadistic behaviors all show someone who was treating murder as a craft to be continually refined and improved. The psychology of Jeffrey's increasingly elaborate fantasies during this period involved creating perfect companions who would never leave him or reject him. His victims weren't just sexual objects, but were intended to become permanent household members who would provide the companionship and acceptance he had never been able to achieve through normal relationships. This fantasy system shows how completely his criminal behavior had become integrated with his deepest emotional needs. Jeffrey's systematic documentation of his crimes through extensive photography reveals psychological needs that went beyond simple trophy-taking to encompass detailed record-keeping of his activities. These photographs served multiple functions. They allowed him to relive his crimes, provided material for fantasy enhancement, and created a permanent record of his achievements. The systematic nature of this documentation shows the organized, methodical approach he brought to his criminal activities. The psychology of Jeffrey's escalating violence and sadism during this period reveals how successful criminal behavior can lead to continuously escalating requirements for psychological satisfaction. As his tolerance for normal levels of control and possession increased, he required increasingly extreme behaviors to achieve the same psychological effects. This escalation pattern is characteristic of addictive behaviors and shows how criminal activities can become self-reinforcing and progressively more severe. Jeffrey's ability to maintain employment and social relationships during this period while conducting increasingly frequent murders reveals extraordinary psychological compartmentalization abilities. His co-workers and acquaintances described him as quiet and unremarkable, showing how effectively he could separate his public persona from his criminal activities. This compartmentalization was crucial to his ability to continue killing for so long without detection. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's systematic killing spree reveals how individual pathology can evolve into sustained criminal campaigns when combined with opportunity and successful concealment. His case demonstrates how serial killing can become a self-reinforcing psychological system that drives escalating frequency and severity of crimes over extended periods. The systematic approach we've examined tonight shows Jeffrey Dahmer at the height of his criminal sophistication, operating an efficient killing machine that claimed 16 lives over for years. His evolution from isolated killer to systematic predator reveals how criminal psychology can develop and refine itself through practice, becoming increasingly deadly and efficient over time. The psychological patterns we've analyzed provide crucial insights into how serial killers develop their methods and escalate their activities. Jeffrey's case shows how successful crimes create confidence and psychological reinforcement that drives continued criminal behavior, while also revealing the warning signs that might have enabled earlier intervention if properly recognized. As we continue our exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology, understanding his systematic killing phase provides the foundation for examining his eventual capture and the psychological factors that led to the end of his reign of terror. The killing machine we've examined tonight would eventually be stopped, but not before claiming 16 more innocent lives and shocking the world with its systematic cruelty and depravity. As our psychological exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer continues, we now examine perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his pathology: his overwhelming need to create perfect, permanently compliant companions who could never reject or abandon him. This wasn't simply about sexual gratification or violence, but about Jeffrey's desperate attempt to solve his lifelong problem of profound loneliness and rejection through the ultimate form of control over other human beings. Understanding this psychological drive reveals how his crimes were fundamentally about possession and companionship rather than mere killing. The psychology of Jeffrey's companion obsession reveals how his early experiences of abandonment and rejection had created an overwhelming fear of being alone that drove all of his criminal behavior. His murders weren't random acts of violence, but systematic attempts to acquire permanent companions who could never leave him, reject him, or cause him the emotional pain that characterized all of his previous relationships. This need for guaranteed companionship became the organizing principle of his entire criminal career. Jeffrey's fantasy of creating zombie-like slaves represents one of the most extreme manifestations of control pathology ever documented in criminal psychology. His experiments with drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting various chemicals into their brains weren't acts of random sadism but systematic attempts to create lobotomized companions who would be completely dependent on him for survival while remaining physically present and responsive to his needs. The psychology behind Jeffrey's zombie experiments reveals someone who understood that living victims would always retain the potential for resistance, escape, or rejection, while dead victims couldn't provide the interaction and companionship he craved. His attempted solution was to create a middle ground: victims who were technically alive but mentally incapacitated enough to be completely compliant and dependent. This represents perhaps the most extreme form of psychological control ever attempted. Jeffrey's systematic approach to these experiments shows sophisticated planning and a scientific mindset applied to the most horrific purposes imaginable. He researched anatomy and neuroscience, experimented with different tools and chemicals, and carefully documented his procedures through photography and notes. This methodical approach demonstrates how intelligence and curiosity can be perverted to serve the most evil purposes when combined with severe personality disorders. The psychology of Jeffrey's failure to successfully create living zombies reveals important aspects of his mental state and relationship with reality. Despite repeated failures and obvious evidence that his experiments weren't working, he continued attempting to create compliant living companions through increasingly elaborate procedures. This persistence in the face of clear failure shows how completely his thinking had become disconnected from reality and rational problem solving. Jeffrey's alternative approach to creating permanent companions involved elaborate preservation of body parts and remains, treating his victims' corpses as if they were still capable of providing companionship and interaction. His conversations with preserved heads, his arrangement of bones into shrine-like displays, and his careful preservation of sexual organs all show someone who was maintaining psychological relationships with deceased victims as if they were still alive. The psychology of Jeffrey's preservation rituals reveals how he had created an entire fantasy world where his victims continued to exist as his companions long after their deaths. His daily interactions with preserved remains, his photographic documentation of his collections, and his elaborate care for his trophies all show someone who had constructed an alternative reality where he was surrounded by the companions he had always craved but could never obtain through normal relationships. Jeffrey's use of photography to document every stage of his crimes and preservation activities reveals psychological needs that went beyond simple trophy-taking to encompass detailed record-keeping of his relationships with victims. These photographs weren't just mementos, but were crucial tools for maintaining his fantasy relationships with deceased victims. He could use the images to relive interactions and maintain psychological connections with his collection of companions. The psychology of Jeffrey's apartment organization reveals how completely his living space had been transformed into a shrine to his victim companions. His careful arrangement of skulls, his preservation equipment, his photographic displays, and his chemical storage all show someone whose entire domestic environment had been organized around maintaining relationships with deceased victims. This transformation demonstrates how thoroughly his pathology had consumed his daily existence. Jeffrey's necrophilic activities with preserved remains reveal psychological patterns where sexual interaction served to maintain his sense of ongoing relationship with his victims. These activities weren't simply sexual but were complex psychological rituals designed to sustain his fantasy that his victims were still present and available for companionship. This shows how sexual behavior can serve attachment needs rather than simple physical gratification. The psychology of Jeffrey's cannibalistic behavior reveals his ultimate attempt to achieve permanent connection with his victims through literal incorporation into his own body. In his twisted thinking, consuming parts of his victims would allow him to carry them with him permanently, creating an intimacy and connection that could never be broken by death or separation. This represents one of the most extreme forms of psychological possession ever documented. Jeffrey's systematic documentation of which victims provided which preserved parts reveals how he had organized his collection like a carefully maintained relationship network. His detailed knowledge of which skull belonged to which victim, his preservation of specific body parts for different purposes, and his photographic cataloging all show someone who was maintaining complex psychological relationships with multiple deceased companions simultaneously. The psychology of Jeffrey's daily routines with his victim collections reveals how completely his normal life had been replaced by interactions with preserved remains. His conversations with skulls, his care for preserved body parts, and his regular viewing of victim photographs all show someone whose primary social relationships were with deceased victims rather than living people. This represents complete withdrawal from normal human society into a world of fantasy companions. Jeffrey's experiments with different preservation techniques and chemicals reveal someone who was constantly seeking to improve his ability to maintain his victim companions in optimal condition. His research into taxidermy, his use of various acids and preservatives, and his elaborate storage systems all show someone who was treating the maintenance of his collection as the most important aspect of his daily life. The psychology of Jeffrey's victim selection during his systematic killing period reveals how his choice of targets was influenced by his need for specific types of companions. He preferred young, attractive men who could serve as idealized partners in his fantasy world. His targeting of individuals who were socially isolated or transient also reflects his understanding that these victims would be less likely to be missed, allowing him to maintain his collections without interference. Jeffrey's increasing boldness in bringing victims to his apartment during this period reveals how his need for companions had overcome his normal caution about detection. His willingness to take unprecedented risks shows how psychologically necessary his victim acquisition activities had become. The compulsive nature of this behavior demonstrates how completely his need for companions had taken over his decision-making processes. The psychology of Jeffrey's relationship with his neighbor Conoric Synthosompphone, whom he briefly managed to lobotomize and keep alive, reveals the closest he ever came to achieving his goal of a living zombie companion. His ability to convince police that the injured and confused teenager was his adult boyfriend shows how sophisticated his deception abilities had become. This incident represents both the peak of his success and the beginning of his downfall. Jeffrey's reaction to losing Conoric Synthosompphone when police returned the boy to him reveals how psychologically devastating the loss of a potential companion could be. His immediate murder of the teenager shows how his need for control and possession had become so overwhelming that partial success was worse than complete failure. This reaction demonstrates the all-or-nothing nature of his psychological needs. The psychology of Jeffrey's escalating frequency of killings during his final period reveals how his tolerance for solitude had been completely destroyed by his experiences with victim companions. As his collection grew, so did his psychological dependence on maintaining and expanding it. The addictive nature of this behavior drove him to take increasingly dangerous risks to acquire new companions. Jeffrey's systematic approach to victim processing reveals how he had developed efficient methods for transforming living people into permanent companions through murder, dismemberment, and preservation. His increasingly refined techniques show someone who had learned to maximize both the psychological satisfaction and practical benefits of his crimes while minimizing waste and disposal problems. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's companion obsession reveals how his crimes served multiple psychological functions simultaneously. They provided sexual gratification, satisfied his need for control, created permanent relationships, and solved his problem of chronic loneliness. This multifunctional nature of his criminal behavior made it particularly addictive and resistant to normal psychological controls. The psychological analysis we've conducted tonight reveals Jeffrey Dahmer as someone whose entire criminal career was driven by a desperate need for companionship that could never be satisfied through normal relationships. His victims weren't just targets for violence, but were intended to become permanent members of his household, providing the acceptance and connection he had never been able to achieve with living people. The companion obsession we've examined represents one of the most extreme manifestations of attachment disorder ever documented, showing how early emotional neglect and social rejection can create psychological needs so overwhelming that murder becomes a rational solution in the disturbed mind. Understanding this psychology is crucial for recognizing similar patterns and potentially preventing similar tragedies. As we continue our exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology, understanding his need for permanent companions provides crucial context for examining his eventual capture and the end of his killing career. The psychological patterns we've analyzed tonight drove every aspect of his criminal behavior and ultimately created the conditions that would lead to his downfall when his need for companions overcame his caution about detection. As our psychological journey through Jeffrey Dahmer's mind continues, we now examine one of the most revealing aspects of his pathology: the transformation of his Milwaukee apartment into what would become known as one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street wasn't simply where Jeffrey lived. It had become a carefully designed laboratory for murder, dismemberment, and preservation that reflected his complete psychological separation from normal human existence. Understanding the psychology behind this space reveals how thoroughly his pathology had consumed every aspect of his daily life. The psychology of how Jeffrey organized his living space reveals someone whose entire domestic environment had been restructured around his criminal activities and fantasy relationships with deceased victims. Every room, every piece of furniture, and every storage area had been repurposed to serve his pathological needs for victim acquisition, processing, and preservation. This complete transformation shows how thoroughly his criminal psychology had displaced normal patterns of human habitation and social interaction. Jeffrey's apartment served multiple psychological functions that went far beyond simple living space to encompass crime scene, laboratory, shrine, and social environment, all within the confines of a modest two-bedroom unit. The psychological significance of combining all these functions in one location reveals someone who had completely withdrawn from normal society into a self-contained world where all of his needs could be met through interaction with his victim, collections, and criminal activities. The psychology of Jeffrey's kitchen modifications reveals how domestic spaces associated with nourishment and sustenance had been perverted to serve his cannibalistic activities and body processing needs. His use of cooking equipment for dismemberment, his storage of human flesh alongside regular food items, and his preparation of victim remains for consumption all show how completely his pathology had corrupted the most basic human activities of food preparation and eating. Jeffrey's refrigerator and freezer contents represented perhaps the most shocking aspect of his apartment, containing severed heads, preserved organs, and packages of human flesh stored alongside normal food items. The psychology of this storage system reveals someone who had completely normalized the presence of human remains in his daily environment, treating victim body parts as routine household items requiring only practical storage considerations rather than emotional processing. The psychology of Jeffrey's bedroom organization reveals how his sleeping space had been transformed into a shrine to his victim relationships, with photographs of crimes and preserved body parts arranged for easy viewing and interaction. His ability to sleep surrounded by evidence of his murders shows complete psychological desensitization to violence and death, while also revealing how thoroughly his fantasy relationships with victims had replaced normal human social connections. Jeffrey's bathroom modifications included chemical equipment for dissolving flesh and bones, turning a space associated with cleansing and hygiene into a body disposal facility. The psychological significance of this transformation reveals how completely his criminal activities had invaded every aspect of his domestic routine, making normal self-care and hygiene activities impossible to separate from his murder and dismemberment processes. The psychology of Jeffrey's living room arrangement reveals how he had created a social space designed for interaction with his victim collections rather than living guests. His careful display of skulls, bones, and photographs shows someone who was maintaining an active social environment with deceased victims, treating preserved remains as if they were capable of providing companionship and conversation during his leisure time. Jeffrey's chemical storage and processing equipment revealed sophisticated knowledge of body dissolution and preservation techniques that he had acquired through research and experimentation. The psychology of this scientific approach to human remains shows someone who had approached murder and dismemberment with the same methodical curiosity that others might apply to legitimate hobbies or professional activities. The psychology of Jeffrey's photographic documentation system reveals how he had created detailed records of his victim relationships and processing activities. His systematic photographing of every stage of his crimes, his careful organization of images, and his regular viewing of these records all show someone who was maintaining complex psychological relationships with his victims through visual documentation of their transformation from living people to preserved remains. Jeffrey's victim trophy collection represented the culmination of his possession psychology, with carefully preserved skulls, bones, and body parts arranged throughout his apartment like sacred objects in a religious shrine. The psychology of this collection reveals someone who had created an alternative spiritual and social world where his relationships with deceased victims provided meaning and purpose that he couldn't find through normal human interactions. The psychology of Jeffrey's daily routines within this environment reveals how completely his normal life patterns had been replaced by activities related to his victim collections and criminal planning. His interactions with preserved remains, his maintenance of his chemical equipment, and his constant documentation activities show someone whose entire existence had become organized around his pathological relationships with deceased victims. Jeffrey's noise management and odor control measures reveal psychological awareness that his activities were abnormal and required concealment from neighbors and authorities. His use of air fresheners, His sound dampening techniques, and his careful timing of disposal activities all show someone who understood the social unacceptability of his behavior while being completely unable to modify or stop his criminal activities. The psychology of how Jeffrey managed unexpected visitors to his apartment reveals sophisticated deception abilities and compartmentalization skills that allowed him to maintain a facade of normalcy even when surrounded by evidence of his crimes. His ability to receive guests, interact with neighbors, and handle maintenance visits while living surrounded by human remains shows remarkable psychological control and planning abilities. Jeffrey's apartment security measures and visitor screening procedures reveal paranoid psychology combined with practical criminal thinking about protecting his victim collections and criminal activities from discovery. His careful control of who entered his space and his elaborate concealment systems show someone who understood that his entire lifestyle depended on maintaining secrecy about his domestic environment. The psychology of Jeffrey's relationship with his apartment building and neighborhood reveals how he had successfully integrated his horrific activities into an apparently normal residential setting. His interactions with building management, his payment of rent and utilities, and his maintenance of tenant relationships all show someone who could function normally in social and business contexts while conducting unprecedented criminal activities in private. Jeffrey's storage and organization systems reveal obsessive-compulsive psychology applied to the most horrific purposes imaginable. His careful labeling of preserved remains, his systematic arrangement of chemical equipment, and his detailed inventory of victim possessions all show someone who had brought the same attention to detail and organizational skills to murder and dismemberment that others might apply to legitimate collecting or scientific activities. The psychology of Jeffrey's victim acquisition strategies reveals how his apartment had become the central component of his predatory activities, serving as both the destination for his victims and the processing facility for their remains. His use of his domestic space as a trap demonstrates how completely his home environment had been weaponized to serve his criminal psychology and victim acquisition needs. Jeffrey's relationship with building maintenance and utility services reveals how he had successfully normalized his extraordinary consumption of water, electricity, and waste disposal services that his criminal activities required. His ability to maintain these relationships while conducting activities that generated unusual demands on building systems shows sophisticated planning and social manipulation abilities. The psychology of Jeffrey's apartment as a complete ecosystem for his criminal lifestyle reveals how thoroughly he had withdrawn from normal society into a self-contained world where all of his psychological needs could be met through criminal activities and interactions with victim collections. This complete separation from normal human society shows the ultimate progression of his social isolation and attachment disorders. Jeffrey's use of his apartment as both crime scene and social environment reveals psychological patterns where his living space had become the entire universe for his emotional and social life. His lack of normal visitors, his absence of typical social activities, and his complete focus on his victim collections show someone who had replaced normal human relationships with pathological interactions with preserved remains. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's apartment environment reveals how living spaces can become physical manifestations of severe mental illness and criminal pathology. His transformation of a normal residential unit into a charnel house shows how thoroughly psychological disorders can corrupt not just behavior, but entire environmental and spatial relationships that support daily existence. The apartment we've examined tonight represents the complete expression of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology in physical form, showing how his need for control, possession, and companionship had transformed every aspect of his domestic environment. This space reveals the full extent of his separation from normal human society and his complete immersion in a world of violence, death, and fantasy relationships. The psychological analysis of this environment provides crucial insights into how severe personality disorders can create alternative realities that exist alongside but completely separate from normal society. Jeffrey's apartment shows how profoundly mental illness can affect not just behavior, but entire approaches to space, social interaction, and daily routine. As we continue our exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychology, understanding his living environment provides crucial context for examining his eventual capture and the shock that discovery of this space would create. The apartment we've analyzed tonight would become the crime scene that finally exposed the full extent of his pathology and ended his killing career forever. The horror of what was discovered in apartment 213 represents the ultimate physical manifestation of Jeffrey Dahmer's psychological pathology, showing how completely his mind had created an alternative reality where murder, dismemberment, and fantasy relationships with corpses had become the organizing principles of daily existence. The period from 1990 to 1991 marked the beginning of the end for Jeffrey Dahmer's killing career, as his overwhelming psychological needs began to override the careful planning and risk management that had protected him for over a decade. His final phase reveals a mind consumed by addiction to murder and possession, where escalating compulsions drove him to take unprecedented risks that would ultimately lead to his capture. Tonight, we examine the psychology of a killer whose own needs became his downfall, showing how even the most calculating predators can be destroyed by the very impulses that drive their crimes. The psychology of Jeffrey's accelerating kill rate during his final period reveals how his tolerance for normal psychological states had been completely destroyed by years of criminal behavior and the temporary satisfaction each murder provided. By 1991, he was killing almost monthly, demonstrating how the psychological relief and gratification he derived from each crime was lasting for progressively shorter periods, creating an addiction-like cycle that demanded increasingly frequent victims. Jeffrey's victim acquisition strategies during this period show dramatic changes from his previously careful approach to a more reckless, impulsive methodology driven by desperate psychological needs. His willingness to approach potential victims in broad daylight, his decreased concern about witness observation, and his casual attitude toward potential detection all reveal someone whose compulsive needs had begun to override the survival instincts that had previously kept him safe. The psychology of Jeffrey's targeting preferences during his final period reveals how his victim selection criteria evolved to prioritize immediate availability and vulnerability over the careful screening that had characterized his earlier crimes. His attraction to younger victims, including several teenagers, reflected not just sexual preference but his growing need for partners who would be easier to manipulate and less likely to resist his control. Jeffrey's approach methods during this final phase show significant deterioration in his previously sophisticated manipulation techniques, as his desperation led to more direct and risky victim contact strategies. His decreasing use of elaborate deception and his more straightforward offers of money or drugs reveal someone whose psychological patience had been eroded by his escalating addiction to killing and possession. The psychology of Jeffrey's treatment of Conric synthesompphone represents perhaps the most revealing incident in understanding his deteriorating mental state and growing desperation. His drugging and sexual assault of the 14-year-old boy, followed by his skull-drilling experiment that left the child in a zombie-like state, shows how completely his experimental psychology had overcome any remaining inhibitions about age, consent, or basic human decency. Jeffrey's interaction with police during the synthesompphone incident reveals both his persistent manipulation abilities and his dangerous overconfidence in those skills. His successful convincing of officers that the injured and confused teenager was his adult boyfriend demonstrates sophisticated deception capabilities, But his willingness to take such an enormous risk also shows how desperately he needed to maintain possession of his experimental victim. The psychology of Jeffrey's immediate murder of Conric phone after regaining custody reveals how his need for absolute control had become so overwhelming that partial success was actually more psychologically threatening than complete failure. Rather than accepting that his zombie experiment had failed and releasing the boy, Jeffrey chose immediate murder, showing how completely his psychology had become organized around all-or-nothing possession of his victims. Jeffrey's escalating boldness in victim disposal during this period reveals psychological confidence that had become completely disconnected from the reality of his situation. His use of building dumpsters near his apartment, his casual transportation of body parts in broad daylight, and his decreasing concern about odor control all show someone whose previous success had created dangerous overconfidence about his ability to continue operating without detection. The psychology of Jeffrey's apartment management during his final period reveals someone who was struggling to maintain his living space as both residence and processing facility while dealing with the practical problems created by an ever-growing collection of human remains. His storage challenges, his chemical odor problems, and his increasing difficulty maintaining normal apartment functions all demonstrate the practical breakdown that paralleled his psychological deterioration. Jeffrey's relationship with his neighbors during this final phase reveals how his facade of normalcy was beginning to crack under the pressure of his escalating criminal activities and the practical problems they created. Increasing complaints about strange odors, unusual noises, and suspicious activities show that his ability to maintain his cover was deteriorating as his criminal behavior intensified and his careful concealment practices broke down. The psychology of Jeffrey's substance abuse during this period reveals desperate attempts to manage the overwhelming stress, paranoia, and internal pressure that his lifestyle was creating. His increased alcohol consumption, his experimentation with other drugs, and his use of substances to incapacitate victims all show someone who was struggling to maintain psychological equilibrium while conducting increasingly frequent and risky criminal activities. Jeffrey's victim processing techniques during this final period reveal someone who was constantly seeking new ways to maximize his psychological satisfaction from each murder while dealing with the practical limitations of his deteriorating situation. His variations in dismemberment methods, his different preservation experiments, and his increasingly elaborate trophy-taking all show someone whose tolerance for routine had been destroyed by his addiction to novel experiences. The psychology of Jeffrey's photographic documentation during his final phase shows escalating obsession with recording and preserving every detail of his criminal activities as his crimes became the central focus of his entire existence. His increasingly elaborate photo sessions, his systematic documentation of victim processing, and his careful organization of images all reveal someone whose relationship with his crimes had become as important as the crimes themselves. Jeffrey's daily routines during this final period reveal someone whose entire existence had become consumed by criminal activities and victim maintenance, with normal life functions becoming secondary considerations. His deteriorating work performance, his minimal social interactions, and his decreasing attention to personal hygiene all show how his psychological energy had become completely focused on his criminal activities and trophy collections. The psychology of Jeffrey's experimental behaviors during this period reveals growing desperation to achieve the perfect companion relationship that had always eluded him. His drilling experiments, his injection of chemicals into victims' brains, and his attempts to create lobotomized slaves all show someone whose fantasy life had become so compelling that he was willing to risk everything to achieve his psychological goals. Jeffrey's victim preservation activities during this final phase reveal someone whose psychological attachment to his victims had become so strong that practical considerations about storage, concealment, and safety were completely secondary to his need for possession. His elaborate chemical preservation methods, his creative storage solutions, and his resistance to disposing of remains all demonstrate how his psychological needs had overwhelmed practical survival considerations. The psychology of Jeffrey's targeting of victims close to his apartment building during this period reveals how his geographical risk tolerance had completely deteriorated under the pressure of his escalating needs. His willingness to hunt in his immediate neighborhood, his casual approaches to local residents, and his decreased concern about being recognized all show someone whose desperation had overcome basic predatory caution. Jeffrey's interaction with building staff and management during this final period reveals how his deception abilities were beginning to fail under the pressure of his escalating activities and the practical problems they created. His increasingly elaborate explanations for suspicious occurrences, his growing paranoia about surveillance, and his defensive responses to routine inquiries all show someone whose psychological state was becoming increasingly unstable and obvious to observers. The psychology of Jeffrey's final victim acquisitions reveals someone whose normal screening and safety procedures had been completely abandoned in favor of immediate gratification of his compulsive needs. His impulsive victim approaches, his decreased attention to security considerations, and his willingness to target individuals who were more likely to be missed all show someone whose psychological controls had deteriorated significantly under addiction-like pressure. Jeffrey's growing carelessness with evidence disposal during this period reveals how his psychological focus had shifted entirely toward victim acquisition and processing, with decreasing attention paid to the practical considerations that had previously ensured his safety. His casual handling of victim belongings, his improper disposal of remains, and his decreasing concern about chemical evidence all show someone whose priorities had become dangerously skewed. The psychology of Jeffrey's sleep patterns and daily functioning during this final period reveals someone who was being consumed by his criminal activities and the psychological pressure they created. His reported insomnia, his increasing reliance on alcohol for sleep, and his deteriorating physical health all show how his lifestyle had become psychologically and physically unsustainable. Jeffrey's communication patterns during this period reveal growing social isolation and withdrawal from normal human contact as his criminal activities consumed more of his psychological energy and attention. His minimal interaction with family, his decreasing workplace socialization, and his avoidance of community activities all show someone whose criminal psychology was crowding out normal social functioning. The psychology of Jeffrey's risk assessment during his final period reveals someone whose judgment had become so impaired by compulsive needs that he was unable to accurately evaluate the dangers his behavior was creating. His casual attitude toward witness observation, his decreased concern about victim resistance, and his apparent blindness to escalating community suspicion all show how addiction-like compulsions can destroy survival instincts. Jeffrey's victim interaction patterns during this final phase reveals someone whose desperation had led him to abandon the patient manipulation and careful control that had characterized his earlier crimes. His more direct approaches, his decreased use of elaborate deception, and his willingness to use force rather than drugs show someone whose psychological patience had been eroded by escalating compulsive needs. The psychology of Jeffrey's fantasy life during this period reveals how his internal world had become so consuming that reality testing was severely impaired. His elaborate scenarios for creating perfect companions, his detailed plans for zombie-like slaves, and his complete absorption in possession fantasies all show someone whose mental life had become dominated by pathological obsessions that overwhelmed practical considerations. Jeffrey's financial management during this final period reveals someone whose spending priorities had become completely organized around his criminal activities rather than normal living expenses. His expenditures on chemicals and equipment, his decreased attention to rent and utilities, and his focus on materials for victim processing all show how his criminal psychology had reorganized his entire approach to resources and priorities. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's final period reveals how criminal addiction can create escalating cycles of behavior that ultimately become self-destructive and unsustainable. His case demonstrates how the temporary satisfaction derived from criminal behavior can create tolerance that requires increasingly frequent and risky activities to maintain psychological equilibrium, eventually leading to behaviors so dangerous that detection becomes inevitable. The psychological patterns we've examined tonight show Jeffrey Dahmer at his most desperate and dangerous, driven by needs that had become so compulsive and overwhelming that they overrode every practical consideration and survival instinct. His final period represents the inevitable conclusion of a psychological journey that had been building towards self-destruction from the moment he committed his first murder. The deterioration we've witnessed reveals how even the most sophisticated criminal psychology contains the seeds of its own destruction when driven by needs so powerful that they eventually overcome all rational controls and safety measures. Jeffrey's final phase shows the ultimate failure of his psychological system to maintain the delicate balance between satisfying his compulsions and avoiding the detection that would end his criminal career. As we examine Jeffrey's psychological unraveling, we see how his growing carelessness and escalating desperation created the exact conditions that would lead to his capture and the end of his reign of terror. The psychological forces that had driven his crimes ultimately became the forces that destroyed him, showing how criminal psychology can become its own worst enemy when needs become too overwhelming to control. July 22, 1991, a date that would forever mark the end of Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year killing career and expose one of the most horrific criminal psychologies in American history. The events of this night represent the culmination of psychological forces that had been building throughout Jeffrey's final period of escalating recklessness and desperation. Tonight, we explore the complex psychology behind Jeffrey's capture, examining how his overwhelming pathological needs ultimately created the conditions for his own downfall and transformed him from careful predator into careless killer whose fatal mistakes finally caught up with him. The psychology of Jeffrey's approach to Tracy Edwards on the evening of July 22 reveals someone whose victim acquisition strategies had deteriorated significantly from his previously careful and methodical approach. His casual contact with Edwards at the Grand Avenue Mall, his straightforward invitation back to his apartment, and his apparent confidence in his ability to control the situation all show someone whose desperation had overcome the cautious planning that had previously protected him from detection. Jeffrey's decision to bring Tracy Edwards to his apartment despite the overwhelming evidence of his crimes that filled every room reveals psychological judgment so impaired that it suggests his contact with reality had become severely compromised. His willingness to expose a potential victim to photographs of previous murders, preserved body parts, and obvious criminal evidence shows someone whose psychological desperation had completely overridden basic survival instincts. The psychology of Jeffrey's behavior during his final victim encounter reveals someone whose fantasy world had become so overwhelming that he began treating living victims as if they were already part of his deceased companion collection. His casual discussion of his crimes with Edwards, his showing of victim photographs as if they were normal social interaction, and his apparent expectation that Edwards would simply accept his fate all demonstrate how completely disconnected from reality his thinking had become. Jeffrey's decision to handcuff Tracy Edwards while revealing his criminal activities represents a catastrophic breakdown in his victim control psychology that had previously relied on complete incapacitation before revealing his true intentions. His abandonment of his established drugging methodology in favor of restraint and intimidation shows how his growing impatience and psychological desperation had led him to abandon the careful techniques that had enabled his previous success. The psychology of Jeffrey's conversation with Tracy Edwards during their final encounter reveals someone who was so psychologically consumed by his criminal identity that he couldn't resist sharing his experiences and demonstrating his expertise. His detailed discussions of his methods, his proud display of victim photographs, and his matter-of-fact descriptions of murder and dismemberment all show someone whose entire sense of self had become organized around his criminal achievements. Jeffrey's apparent confidence that Tracy Edwards would cooperate with his plans reveals psychological delusion about his ability to control victims and situations that had reached dangerous levels of unreality. His casual assumption that Edwards would accept being murdered, his surprise at Edwards' resistance, and his inability to adapt when his control techniques failed all demonstrate how completely his psychology had become disconnected from normal human responses. The psychology of Jeffrey's weapon selection during his final victim encounter reveals someone whose preparation and planning abilities had deteriorated significantly under the pressure of his escalating compulsions. His reliance on a knife rather than his previously successful drugging methods shows how his desperation had led him to abandon the sophisticated techniques that had enabled his long criminal career. Tracy Edwards' successful resistance and escape represents the first time in Jeffrey's criminal career that a victim had successfully challenged his control and reached safety, revealing how his victim management skills had deteriorated along with his general psychological functioning. Jeffrey's inability to prevent Edwards' escape shows how his confidence in his control abilities had become dangerously overinflated, while his actual capabilities declined. The psychology of Jeffrey's response to Tracy Edwards' escape reveals someone who was so psychologically unprepared for victim resistance that he was completely unable to adapt his behavior to prevent discovery. His failure to flee his apartment, destroy evidence, or take any protective action shows how thoroughly his psychological defenses had collapsed and how completely he had lost the ability to think strategically about his survival. Jeffrey's decision to remain in his apartment after Edwards escaped, despite knowing that police would likely be contacted, reveals either complete psychological breakdown or such dangerous overconfidence in his manipulation abilities that he believed he could control even a police investigation. This decision represents the final expression of the psychological deterioration that had been building throughout his final killing period. The psychology of Jeffrey's interaction with responding police officers reveals sophisticated manipulation abilities that persisted even in his deteriorating mental state, but also demonstrates how his overconfidence in these skills had become completely unrealistic. His calm demeanor when police arrived, his reasonable explanations for Edwards' claims, and his invitation for officers to enter his apartment all show someone who was still attempting to use charm and deception despite the obvious futility of such approaches. Jeffrey's willingness to allow police officers into his apartment filled with overwhelming evidence of his crimes represents either complete psychological collapse or such profound disconnection from reality that he couldn't comprehend the consequences of his actions. His casual attitude toward police presence in his residence shows judgment so impaired that it suggests his ability to assess risk and consequences had been completely destroyed. The psychology of Jeffrey's behavior during the initial police search reveals someone who was watching his entire psychological world collapse in real time while being unable to mount any effective response. His apparent calm as officers discovered evidence of his crimes may have represented psychological shock and dissociation rather than emotional control, showing how completely unprepared he was for the reality of exposure despite years of successful criminal activity. Jeffrey's transition from attempted deception to passive compliance when police discovered severed heads in his refrigerator reveals how quickly his psychological control collapsed once his crimes were undeniably revealed. His rapid shift from manipulation attempts to complete cooperation shows how thoroughly his psychology had been dependent on secrecy and concealment, and how devastating exposure was to his entire psychological system. The psychology of Jeffrey's immediate confession after his arrest reveals patterns that distinguish his response from typical criminal captures, as most offenders maintain denial or seek legal protection rather than providing detailed admissions. His willingness to confess extensively almost immediately suggests either psychological relief at finally being stopped or complete psychological collapse that made continued deception impossible. Jeffrey's detailed confessions during his initial interrogation reveal someone whose entire psychological identity had become so completely organized around his crimes that he was eager to discuss them once the secrecy barrier had been broken. His systematic recounting of his murders, his detailed descriptions of his methods, and his apparent pride in his criminal sophistication all show how central these activities had become to his sense of self and personal identity. The psychology of Jeffrey's cooperation with investigators reveals someone whose need for attention and recognition was so strong that it overcame any remaining survival instincts or legal self-preservation concerns. His willingness to provide extensive details about his crimes, his assistance with victim identification, and his apparent enjoyment of being recognized as an expert on his own criminal behavior all show how his narcissistic needs persisted even in custody. Jeffrey's demeanor during his arrest processing reveals someone who was experiencing complex psychological responses combining relief, exhaustion, and continued need for control and attention. His calm cooperation with booking procedures, his detailed responses to questions, and his apparent interest in the investigation process all show someone whose psychology was adapting quickly to his new circumstances while maintaining core personality patterns. The psychology of Jeffrey's interaction with media representatives after his arrest reveals how quickly he began transforming his criminal notoriety into a new source of psychological satisfaction and attention. His strategic cooperation with journalists, his careful management of information release, and his apparent pleasure in discussing his crimes all show how rapidly he adapted to his new role as a famous criminal case study. Jeffrey's legal decision-making during his initial custody period reveals psychological priorities that favored maintaining his image as a rational, sophisticated criminal over practical legal considerations about minimizing punishment or seeking treatment. His early cooperation with prosecution, his apparent acceptance of his situation, and his focus on telling his story accurately all show someone whose psychological needs for recognition were more important than legal self-preservation. The psychology of Jeffrey's adjustment to custody conditions reveals someone who was experiencing both relief at being stopped and withdrawal from the compulsive behaviors that had consumed his life for over a decade. His calm adaptation to jail routines, his cooperative behavior with staff, and his apparent acceptance of confinement suggests that part of him welcomed the end of the overwhelming psychological pressure created by his criminal lifestyle. Jeffrey's immediate recognition of the hopelessness of his legal situation reveals psychological realism about his circumstances that contrasted sharply with the delusional thinking that had characterized his final criminal period. His apparent acceptance that his criminal career was over, his lack of denial about the evidence against him, and his focus on managing his story rather than avoiding punishment all show someone whose contact with reality had been partially restored by his capture. The psychology of Jeffrey's victim identification assistance reveals someone who maintained detailed psychological records of his criminal activities and was eager to demonstrate his expertise and cooperation with authorities. His ability to provide specific information about victim identities, crime locations, and disposal methods shows how systematically he had cataloged his criminal experiences and how important it was to him to be recognized for his thoroughness and sophistication. Jeffrey's response to the discovery of evidence in his apartment reveals someone who was simultaneously shocked by the exposure of his secret world and proud of the sophistication and extent of his criminal achievements. His detailed explanations of his preservation methods, his descriptions of his trophy collections, and his apparent satisfaction with the thoroughness of evidence collection all show complex psychological responses to finally having his work revealed and evaluated. The psychology of Jeffrey's transition from active criminal to captured defendant reveals how quickly his psychological needs found new outlets and expressions when his criminal activities became impossible. His adaptation to media attention, his cooperation with legal proceedings, and his engagement with his role as a famous criminal all show remarkable psychological flexibility in finding alternative sources of satisfaction and recognition. Jeffrey's interaction with his family immediately following his arrest reveals complex emotions combining guilt, relief, and continued need for approval and understanding that had characterized these relationships throughout his life. His communications with his father, his expressions of regret for family embarrassment, and his apparent concern for their welfare show how his limited capacity for emotional connection persisted even in his deteriorated psychological state. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's capture reveals how escalating pathological needs can ultimately become self-destructive, creating the very conditions that lead to a criminal's downfall and exposure. His case demonstrates how even the most careful and calculating predators can be undone by their own psychological desperation when their needs become so overwhelming that they override practical considerations and survival instincts. The capture we've examined tonight represents the inevitable conclusion of Jeffrey's psychological journey from careful predator to desperate killer, showing how his final mistakes weren't random errors, but the direct result of psychological deterioration that had been building throughout his criminal career. His arrest marked not just the end of his killing spree, but the exposure of one of criminal history's most complex and disturbing psychological profiles. The psychology of Jeffrey's final victim encounter and subsequent capture reveals how criminal overconfidence and escalating pathological needs can combine to create perfect storms of self-destructive behavior that ultimately defeat even the most sophisticated criminal psychology. His case provides crucial insights into how serial killers eventually become victims of their own psychological limitations and escalating desperation. Jeffrey's arrest exposed not just his crimes, but the complete psychological system that had enabled them, revealing the apartment of horror that would shock investigators and provide unprecedented insights into how extreme criminal psychology manifests in daily life and living spaces. His capture opened the door to understanding one of the most complex and disturbing minds in criminal history. As we conclude our examination of Jeffrey's capture, we see how his violent end reflected the same psychological themes that had characterized his entire criminal career: the ultimate failure of his psychological system to maintain the balance between satisfying his compulsive needs and avoiding the detection that would destroy his carefully constructed world of control and possession. The controlled environment of jail and courtroom stripped away the privacy that had enabled Jeffrey's crimes for over a decade, revealing new dimensions of his psychology under intense scrutiny and public exposure. His behavior while awaiting trial and during legal proceedings provides crucial insights into how his mind operated when deprived of the victim acquisition and control that had defined his existence. Tonight, we explore the fascinating psychology of Jeffrey in custody, how someone whose entire life had been organized around murder and possession adapted to confinement and transformed into a cooperative defendant eager to discuss his crimes. The psychology of Jeffrey's initial arrest and booking reveals someone experiencing a complex mixture of relief and psychological withdrawal from the compulsive behaviors that had consumed his life. His unusually calm demeanor during processing, his immediate cooperation with authorities, and his apparent lack of panic or denial suggests that part of him welcomed the end of the overwhelming pressure created by his escalating killing schedule and the constant fear of discovery. Jeffrey's immediate confession pattern reveals psychological dynamics rarely seen in serial killer cases, as most captured predators maintain denial or minimize their crimes. His eagerness to provide detailed admissions, his systematic approach to describing his methods, and his apparent pride in his criminal sophistication all show someone whose entire psychological identity had become so organized around his crimes that secrecy had become more burdensome than exposure. The psychology of Jeffrey's detailed confessions reveals someone who had maintained elaborate mental records of his criminal activities and was genuinely excited to finally have an appropriate audience for sharing his experiences. His ability to recall specific details about murders committed years earlier, his systematic chronological approach to confession, and his apparent pleasure in demonstrating his criminal expertise show how central these activities had been to his self-image and identity. Jeffrey's interaction with investigators during his confession period reveals sophisticated psychological manipulation combined with genuine cooperation, as he used his willingness to confess as leverage to maintain some control over the process. His strategic revelation of information, his careful management of investigator attention, and his apparent enjoyment of being treated as an expert on his own crimes show how his need for recognition and control found new outlets even in custody. The psychology of Jeffrey's adjustment to jail conditions reveals remarkable adaptability in someone whose entire existence had been organized around freedom to acquire and control victims. His compliance with institutional rules, his cooperative behavior with staff, and his apparent acceptance of confinement suggest that the external structure provided psychological relief from the internal pressure of his compulsions. Jeffrey's media interactions while in custody reveal how quickly he adapted to his new role as a famous criminal, using public attention to satisfy psychological needs that had previously been met through victim acquisition and control. His strategic cooperation with journalists, his careful management of his public image, and his apparent pleasure in discussing his crimes show how his narcissistic needs found new expressions even in confinement. The psychology of Jeffrey's legal strategy decisions reveals priorities that favored maintaining his image as a rational, sophisticated criminal over practical considerations about avoiding punishment. His rejection of insanity defenses that might have saved his life, his insistence on pleading guilty, and his cooperation with prosecution all show someone whose psychological needs for recognition and intellectual respect were more important than legal self-preservation. Jeffrey's relationship with his defense attorneys reveals complex dynamics where his cooperation was motivated more by his desire to tell his story than by any genuine interest in mounting an effective defense. His detailed discussions of his crimes with legal counsel, his resistance to strategies that might minimize his responsibility, and his apparent preference for pleading guilty all demonstrate how his psychological needs overrode practical legal considerations. The psychology of Jeffrey's courtroom behavior during pretrial hearings reveals someone who was treating legal proceedings as performance opportunities to demonstrate his criminal sophistication and psychological complexity. His attentive participation in hearings, his apparent intellectual engagement with legal procedures, and his careful observation of public reactions show how he was using the courtroom as a stage for his final public presentations. Jeffrey's psychological evaluation by court-appointed experts reveals someone who was simultaneously cooperative and manipulative, providing extensive information about his mental state while carefully managing how that information was interpreted and presented. His detailed discussions of his psychology, his analytical approach to his own pathology, and his apparent insight into his mental processes show remarkable self-awareness combined with fundamental emotional detachment. The psychology of Jeffrey's testimony during his trial reveals someone who was using the witness stand as the ultimate platform for sharing his criminal experiences and demonstrating his expertise. His detailed descriptions of his methods, his clinical discussions of his psychological motivations, and his apparent comfort discussing horrific acts in public all show how completely he had emotionally detached from the human impact of his crimes. Jeffrey's demeanor during victim impact testimony reveals his complete inability to experience genuine empathy or emotional connection to his victims' suffering, despite his intellectual understanding of the pain he had caused. His mechanical expressions of regret, his clinical responses to emotional testimony, and his apparent puzzlement at family grief all demonstrate the profound emotional deficits that had enabled his criminal behavior. The psychology of Jeffrey's reaction to crime scene evidence and photographs reveals someone who could view documentation of his own horrific acts with the same detachment as a scientific observer. His calm responses to graphic evidence, his matter-of-fact corrections of investigative details, and his apparent pride in the thoroughness of evidence collection show how completely he had dehumanized his victims and his crimes. Jeffrey's interaction with other defendants and inmates during his custody period reveals how his manipulation skills adapted to institutional environments while maintaining his core psychological patterns. His strategic sharing of commissary items, his careful cultivation of protective relationships, and his management of his celebrity status show how his social intelligence continued to function in completely changed circumstances. The psychology of Jeffrey's correspondence during custody reveals ongoing needs for attention and intellectual stimulation that found new outlets through communication with researchers, journalists, and members of the public. His detailed letters, his willingness to discuss his psychology, and his apparent pleasure in being treated as a subject of scholarly interest demonstrate how quickly he adapted to his role as a famous criminal case study. Jeffrey's religious exploration during custody reveals complex motivations that may have combined genuine spiritual searching with continued manipulation of authority figures and attention-seeking behavior. His participation in religious services, his discussions with chaplains, and his expressions of spiritual interest show psychological patterns that are difficult to evaluate for authenticity given his history of sophisticated deception. The psychology of Jeffrey's daily routines in custody reveals how someone whose entire existence had been organized around criminal activities adapted to environments where those behaviors were impossible. His adjustment to structured schedules, his engagement with educational opportunities, and his maintenance of personal hygiene show remarkable psychological flexibility and adaptation to dramatically changed circumstances. Jeffrey's relationship with his family during custody reveals complex patterns of guilt, affection, and manipulation that had characterized these relationships throughout his life. His regular correspondence with his father, his expressions of remorse for family embarrassment, and his apparent concern for their welfare show how his limited capacity for emotional connection persisted even in his deteriorated psychological state. The psychology of Jeffrey's response to public attention and media coverage reveals persistent needs for control over his narrative that had characterized his entire adult life. His corrections of factual errors in reporting, his strategic revelations of new information, and his apparent satisfaction with his notoriety show how his narcissistic needs found new outlets through media attention. Jeffrey's behavior during legal proceedings reveals someone who was more interested in having his story told accurately than in avoiding punishment or seeking reduced sentences. His cooperation with prosecution, His detailed testimony about his crimes and his apparent acceptance of his fate suggests that the legal proceedings were serving psychological functions related to recognition and validation rather than practical goals of avoiding punishment. The psychology of Jeffrey's prison preparation reveals someone who was psychologically ready for long-term incarceration and may have viewed prison as a relief from the psychological pressure of maintaining his criminal lifestyle. His calm acceptance of his sentence, his apparent lack of appeals, interest, and his cooperative attitude toward incarceration suggests that imprisonment represented liberation from unbearable internal pressure. Jeffrey's interaction with mental health professionals during custody reveals continued intellectual engagement with his own psychology combined with persistent emotional detachment from the human consequences of his behavior. His participation in psychological evaluations, his analytical discussions of his mental state, and his apparent interest in his own case as a psychological phenomenon show how he continued to treat his pathology as an interesting academic subject. The psychology of Jeffrey's attitude toward his victims during custody reveals complete objectification that persisted even when discussing their deaths in legal proceedings. His clinical descriptions of their final moments, his matter-of-fact discussions of their suffering, and his apparent inability to understand family grief show how thoroughly his victims had been dehumanized in his psychological world. Jeffrey's response to sentencing reveals psychological acceptance that may have represented relief at finally being stopped rather than disappointment at being punished. His calm reaction to life imprisonment, his lack of apparent anger at the verdict, and his continued cooperation with authorities suggests that his psychological burden had become so overwhelming that permanent incarceration represented welcome external control. The psychology of Jeffrey's preparation for prison life reveals systematic thinking about how to adapt his psychological needs and manipulation skills to institutional environments. His apparent lack of concern about prison dangers, his strategic thinking about inmate relationships, and his continued focus on maintaining his story show how his fundamental psychological patterns prepared to find new expressions in prison. Understanding Jeffrey's custody psychology reveals how someone whose entire existence had been organized around victim acquisition and control could function when those behaviors became permanently impossible. His adaptation shows both the flexibility of his psychological patterns and their persistence in finding new outlets for fundamental needs and drives. The psychology of Jeffrey's legal period represents a crucial transition where his criminal identity was transformed into celebrity criminal status, providing new sources of attention and recognition that partially replaced the psychological satisfaction he had derived from his crimes. This transformation shows how persistent psychological needs can find alternative expressions when circumstances force behavioral change. Jeffrey's cooperation with law enforcement during custody reveals how his need for recognition and intellectual validation could be redirected toward constructive purposes when properly channeled. His assistance with case resolution, his detailed confessions, and his cooperation with investigations show potential for his psychological patterns to serve positive rather than destructive purposes under appropriate external control. The psychological insights gained from Jeffrey's custody period provide crucial understanding of how extreme criminal psychology can persist and adapt when criminal behavior becomes impossible. His case demonstrates both the consistency of fundamental personality patterns and their capacity for finding new expressions and applications when environmental circumstances change dramatically. As we examine Jeffrey's psychology during custody and trial, we see how his fundamental psychological needs for attention, control, and recognition found new outlets through legal proceedings and media attention. His behavior during this period reveals both the persistence of his core psychological patterns and their remarkable adaptability to completely changed circumstances and environmental constraints. The custody period we've analyzed tonight shows Jeffrey Dahmer as someone whose sophisticated criminal psychology continued to operate even when criminal behavior was impossible, finding new expressions and satisfying fundamental psychological needs through cooperation with authorities and management of his public image. This consistency provides important insights into the nature of severe personality disorders and their resistance to fundamental change even under extreme circumstances. Jeffrey's transition to long-term incarceration at Columbia Correctional Institution marked the beginning of his final psychological chapter, where someone whose entire existence had been organized around victim acquisition and control had to find meaning and satisfaction within the rigid constraints of maximum security prison. Understanding how Jeffrey adapted to life imprisonment reveals fascinating insights into the persistence of personality patterns and the ways that even the most disturbed minds can function when their pathological behaviors become permanently impossible. The psychology of Jeffrey's initial adjustment to maximum security prison reveals someone who approached incarceration with the same analytical mindset and systematic planning that he had applied to his criminal activities. His careful observation of prison hierarchies, his strategic assessment of inmate relationships, and his methodical planning for personal safety show how his intelligence and manipulation skills immediately began adapting to serve survival needs rather than predatory purposes. Jeffrey's approach to prison social dynamics reveals sophisticated understanding of how to navigate dangerous institutional environments while maintaining his psychological needs for attention and recognition. His careful management of his celebrity status among inmates, his strategic cultivation of protective relationships, and his calculated sharing of commissary privileges show how his social intelligence found new applications in the prison environment. The psychology of Jeffrey's work assignments reveals someone who was capable of reliable, productive behavior when his pathological urges were externally controlled and his basic psychological needs were being met through other means. His consistent performance in cleaning duties, his cooperative attitude with supervisors, and his adherence to work schedules demonstrate psychological capacities that had been overwhelmed by criminal compulsions during his free period. Jeffrey's daily routines in prison reveal how someone whose previous existence had been chaotic and driven by compulsive behaviors adapted remarkably well to the structure and predictability of institutional life. His maintenance of regular sleep schedules, his participation in meal routines, and his engagement with recreational activities show how external structure could provide psychological stability that he had been unable to achieve independently. The psychology of Jeffrey's educational pursuits during incarceration reveals ongoing intellectual needs and achievement motivation that found constructive outlets when criminal activities were no longer possible. His engagement with correspondence courses, his participation in educational programs, and his continued reading and learning show how his intelligence sought challenges and stimulation even in the restricted prison environment. Jeffrey's correspondence activities reveal how his need for attention and intellectual validation found new outlets through communication with researchers, journalists, and members of the public interested in his case. His detailed letters discussing his psychology, his cooperation with academic studies, and his apparent pleasure in being treated as an expert on criminal psychology show how his narcissistic needs adapted to institutional constraints. The psychology of Jeffrey's religious exploration during imprisonment reveals complex motivations that combine genuine spiritual searching with continued attention-seeking behavior and manipulation of authority figures. His regular attendance at religious services, his discussions with chaplains, and his expressions of repentance and spiritual interest demonstrate psychological complexity that makes his authentic spiritual development difficult to evaluate. Jeffrey's relationship with prison staff reveals how his charm and manipulation abilities continued to operate in institutional settings while being directed toward more benign purposes than during his criminal period. His cooperative behavior with guards, his compliance with institutional rules, and his strategic cultivation of positive staff relationships show how his social skills adapted to serve institutional survival needs. The psychology of Jeffrey's interaction with other high-profile inmates reveals how his celebrity criminal status functioned within the complex social hierarchies of maximum security prison. His relationships with other notorious criminals, his participation in informal inmate leadership structures, and his management of his reputation show sophisticated understanding of institutional social dynamics. Jeffrey's adaptation to the restrictions and deprivations of prison life reveals remarkable psychological resilience in someone whose previous lifestyle had been completely organized around satisfying immediate impulses and maintaining absolute control. His acceptance of limited privacy, restricted movement, and regimented schedules demonstrates psychological flexibility that had been masked by his previous criminal lifestyle. The psychology of Jeffrey's personal hygiene and self-care during imprisonment reveals someone who is capable of maintaining normal standards when external structure supported appropriate behavior. His attention to grooming, his care for his living space, and his adherence to health routines show psychological capacities that had been corrupted by his criminal psychology but were capable of recovery under institutional support. Jeffrey's participation in prison programs reveals someone who was actively seeking structure and purpose to replace the organizing principles that his criminal activities had previously provided. His engagement with educational opportunities, his participation in work details, and his involvement in recreational activities demonstrate attempts to create meaning and routine in an environment where his previous sources of satisfaction were unavailable. The psychology of Jeffrey's sleep patterns and reported dream content during imprisonment reveals ongoing psychological processing of his criminal experiences and their consequences. His discussions of nightmares related to his victims, his sleep disturbances, and his ongoing preoccupation with his crimes show how his psychology continued to be dominated by his criminal past even when criminal behavior was impossible. Jeffrey's approach to conflict resolution and interpersonal problem solving in prison demonstrates how his intelligence and strategic thinking found constructive applications when directed away from criminal purposes. His ability to navigate disputes with other inmates, his strategic thinking about personal safety, and his diplomatic approaches to institutional problems show psychological capacities that had been perverted by his criminal psychology. The psychology of Jeffrey's attitude toward his future during incarceration reveals complex patterns of acceptance, resignation, and continued self-interest that characterized his adaptation to permanent imprisonment. His apparent acceptance of life sentences, his lack of serious escape planning, and his engagement with long-term institutional activities show psychological adjustment to permanent incarceration combined with persistent survival instincts. Jeffrey's interaction with family members during his prison years reveals how his limited capacity for emotional connection functioned under the stress of permanent separation and continued public notoriety. His maintenance of correspondence with his father, his emotional responses to family problems, and his apparent concern for loved ones show how his attachment capabilities, while severely impaired, had not been completely destroyed. The psychology of Jeffrey's reaction to media coverage and public interest in his case during imprisonment reveals persistent needs for control over his narrative and public image. His responses to documentaries about his crimes, his reactions to books written about his case, and his continued engagement with journalists show how his narcissistic needs found ongoing expression even in highly controlled environments. Jeffrey's participation in psychological research and clinical studies during imprisonment reveals how his cooperation with mental health professionals served multiple psychological functions, including attention-seeking, intellectual stimulation, and continued validation of his importance as a criminal case study. His detailed discussions with researchers and his apparent pleasure in being studied demonstrate ongoing needs for recognition and intellectual engagement. The psychology of Jeffrey's institutional disciplinary record reveals someone who generally functioned well within prison structure while occasionally testing boundaries in ways that demonstrated persistent needs for control and attention. His minor infractions, his responses to disciplinary actions, and his overall compliance show adaptation to institutional authority combined with persistent aspects of his personality pathology. Jeffrey's relationship with prison mental health services reveals ongoing psychological needs combined with sophisticated manipulation of treatment providers and continued emotional detachment from genuine therapeutic engagement. His participation in counseling, his discussions of his mental state, and his apparent cooperation with treatment show complex motivations that included attention seeking alongside potential genuine psychological exploration. The psychology of Jeffrey's commissary and financial management during imprisonment reveals practical intelligence and planning abilities that had been applied to criminal purposes during his free period but found constructive expression in institutional settings. His budgeting, his strategic purchasing, and his sharing behaviors show organizational skills adapted to prison economics and social relationships. Jeffrey's participation in recreational activities and leisure pursuits reveals attempts to find satisfaction and meaning through non-criminal activities when his previous sources of psychological gratification were no longer available. His engagement with games, reading, television, and other activities show how he sought to fill time and find enjoyment within institutional constraints. The psychology of Jeffrey's physical health maintenance during imprisonment reveals someone who was motivated to preserve his well-being and maintain his physical condition even when facing life imprisonment. His attention to medical care, his participation in health programs, and his adherence to treatment recommendations show ongoing investment in his survival and well-being. Jeffrey's adaptation to prison food and institutional dining reveals how someone whose previous eating habits had included cannibalism could adjust to conventional institutional meals. His acceptance of prison food, his participation in dining routines, and his apparent lack of eating disorders show psychological compartmentalization that allowed normal functioning in this area despite his criminal history. The psychology of Jeffrey's response to violence and conflicts within the prison environment reveals someone who generally avoided confrontation while remaining aware of institutional dangers. His strategies for staying safe, his responses to threatening situations, and his management of his vulnerable position show sophisticated survival psychology adapted to dangerous institutional environments. Jeffrey's intellectual activities and mental stimulation during imprisonment reveal ongoing cognitive needs that found expression through reading, correspondence, and participation in educational programs. His continued learning, his intellectual discussions, and his engagement with complex subjects show how his intelligence sought challenges and growth even within institutional constraints. The psychology of Jeffrey's adjustment to institutional authority reveals someone who generally cooperated with prison officials while maintaining subtle needs for control and recognition. His compliance with rules, his respectful interactions with staff, and his strategic behavior show adaptation to hierarchical structures while preserving aspects of his personality that required attention and validation. Jeffrey's participation in institutional routines and scheduled activities reveals how external structure could organize his behavior and provide psychological stability that he had been unable to achieve through self-regulation. His adherence to schedules, His participation in required activities and his maintenance of routines show how institutional control could compensate for his internal psychological deficits. Understanding Jeffrey's prison psychology reveals how even individuals with severe personality disorders can adapt to highly structured environments when their pathological behaviors are externally controlled and their basic psychological needs are met through alternative means. His case demonstrates both the persistence of fundamental personality patterns and their capacity for constructive expression under appropriate environmental conditions. The prison adaptation we've examined tonight shows Jeffrey as someone whose core psychological characteristics remain consistent while finding new expressions and applications within institutional constraints. His successful adjustment to prison life demonstrates how external structure and control can enable functional behavior even in individuals with extreme psychological pathology. Jeffrey's prison psychology reveals important insights into the management of dangerous individuals and the potential for behavioral modification through environmental control rather than internal psychological change. His case suggests that appropriate external structure and supervision can enable functional behavior even when fundamental personality pathology remains unchanged. As we examine Jeffrey's final years in prison, we see how his sophisticated psychology continued to operate and adapt even when his criminal behaviors were permanently impossible. His prison experience provides crucial insights into how personality disorders persist while finding new expressions and how institutional environments can channel even disturbed psychology toward more constructive purposes. The psychological patterns observed during Jeffrey's incarceration reveal both the remarkable consistency of severe personality disorders and their capacity for adaptation when environmental circumstances require behavioral change. His prison psychology demonstrates how fundamental psychological needs persist while finding new outlets and expressions even under extreme institutional control. November 28, 1994, a date that would mark the violent end of Jeffrey Dahmer's life and close one of criminal psychology's most disturbing chapters. The brutal murder of Jeffrey at the hands of fellow inmate Christopher Scarver wasn't just another prison killing, it represented the culmination of psychological forces that had been building throughout his incarceration. Tonight, we explore the complex psychology surrounding Jeffrey's death, the prison dynamics that made it inevitable, and what his final moments reveal about the mind that had terrorized Milwaukee for over a decade. The institutional environment at Columbia Correctional Institution had become a psychological pressure cooker where Jeffrey's notoriety, combined with the nature of his crimes, created conditions that made violence almost inevitable. His celebrity status among inmates was a double-edged sword that provided both protection and made him a target. Understanding this dynamic reveals how even maximum security prisons struggle to manage inmates whose crimes have achieved cultural infamy. Jeffrey's awareness of his precarious position reveals psychological adaptation to constant threat that had developed throughout his incarceration. His careful movement through the facility, his strategic interaction with other inmates, and his cooperation with protective measures all show someone who understood the dangers he faced, but was psychologically committed to maintaining as much normalcy as possible within the constraints of his situation. The psychology of daily threat assessment that Jeffrey had to conduct reveals the exhausting mental gymnastics required to survive in an environment where his very existence was considered an affront by many fellow inmates. His constant vigilance, his careful reading of social dynamics, and his strategic positioning during various activities all demonstrate sophisticated survival psychology that had developed through months of institutional living. Christopher Scarver's background reveals a complex psychological profile that made him particularly dangerous to someone like Jeffrey. Born into poverty and raised in a dysfunctional family environment, Scarver had developed severe mental illness combined with religious extremism and racial hatred that created a perfect storm of psychological factors. His documented history of violent behavior and delusional thinking made him an ideal candidate for the kind of vigilante justice that Jeffrey's crimes seemed to invite. The religious delusions that drove Scarver's thinking reveal how mental illness can create psychological frameworks that justify extreme violence in the minds of disturbed individuals. His belief that he was an instrument of divine justice, his conviction that Jeffrey represented ultimate evil, and his sense of religious mission all combined to create psychological permission for murder that overcame normal institutional controls and personal survival instincts. Scarver's documented antipathy toward Jeffrey's crimes reveals how certain types of criminal behavior can trigger violent responses even among hardened criminals. His specific revulsion at Jeffrey's cannibalism and necrophilia, his anger at Jeffrey's perceived lack of remorse, and his belief that Jeffrey was receiving special treatment all created psychological pressure that built toward inevitable explosion. The racial dynamics that influence Scarver's hatred of Jeffrey reveal how prison social structures can amplify existing prejudices and create additional motivations for violence. Jeffrey's targeting of primarily minority victims had created special resentment among Black inmates who viewed his crimes as racially motivated, adding another layer of danger to his already precarious position within the prison hierarchy. Jeffrey's behavior during his final weeks reveals someone who had adapted psychologically to institutional life but remained fundamentally unaware of the specific threat that Scarver represented. His continued participation in work details, his maintenance of normal routines, and his apparent sense of relative security all show how even sophisticated threat assessment can fail to identify specific dangers in complex institutional environments. The work details system that brought Jeffrey and Scarver together reveals institutional failures in risk assessment and inmate management that created the opportunity for violence. The assignment of known enemies to the same work area, the inadequate supervision of high-risk situations, and the availability of improvised weapons all demonstrate how systematic institutional failures can create perfect storms for violence. Jeffrey's psychological state on the morning of November 28th reveals someone who was functioning according to established routines without any apparent premonition of danger. His normal interaction with staff, his participation in work assignments, and his typical behavior patterns all suggest that he had no awareness that this day would be different from countless others he had experienced during his incarceration. The psychology of workplace dynamics in prison settings reveals how even routine activities can become deadly when they involve inmates with histories of extreme violence and mental illness. The gymnasium where Jeffrey was killed had been the site of previous incidents, and the combination of heavy equipment, minimal supervision, and high-risk inmates created conditions where violence was not just possible but likely. Scarver's mental preparation for the murders reveals systematic planning and psychological conditioning that had been developing over months of institutional observation and fantasy development. His identification of weapons, his study of Jeffrey's routines, and his development of justifications for violence all show someone who was methodically preparing for an opportunity to act on his violent impulses. The actual moment of attack reveals Scarver's psychological transformation from institutional inmate to avenging killer as he implemented plans that had been developing in his disturbed mind for months. His use of a 20-inch metal bar from exercise equipment shows premeditation and planning, while his targeting of both Jeffrey and Jesse Anderson during the same incident reveals systematic rather than impulsive violence. Jeffrey's psychological response to the initial attack can only be inferred from physical evidence and witness accounts, but his apparent surprise and inability to mount effective defense suggests that he was completely unprepared for the assault. Despite his general awareness of institutional dangers, his final moments were characterized by confusion and terror as his carefully maintained prison adaptations collapsed in the face of overwhelming violence. The psychology of Scarver's attack pattern reveals someone who was implementing a carefully planned execution rather than acting in emotional rage. His systematic targeting of vital areas, his continuation of the assault beyond what was necessary for incapacitation, and his apparent calm during the violence all demonstrate the cold, calculated approach of someone who was fulfilling what he perceived as a moral obligation. The immediate aftermath of the murders reveals how Jeffrey's death created complex psychological responses throughout the institution, with some inmates celebrating his killing while others worried about the implications for their own safety. The institutional lockdown that followed demonstrates how a single act of violence can disrupt entire prison systems and create psychological trauma that extends far beyond the immediate victims. Jesse Anderson's inclusion as a victim in Scarver's attack reveals how institutional violence can expand beyond primary targets to include anyone who becomes associated with despised inmates. Anderson's presence during the attack made him a target simply through proximity, demonstrating how prison violence can escalate unpredictably and claim unintended victims. The psychology of institutional response to Jeffrey's murder reveals complex organizational dynamics involving liability concerns, public relations, management, and genuine shock at the failure of protective systems. Staff reactions range from professional concern about security failures to private relief that a problematic inmate was no longer their responsibility. Public reaction to Jeffrey's death reveals deep-seated psychological conflicts about justice, punishment, and the protection of even the most despised criminals. Celebrations of his murder by some segments of society demonstrate how his crimes had created such profound revulsion that many people viewed his death as appropriate closure rather than a tragic failure of institutional safety measures. The psychology of victim family responses to Jeffrey's death reveals complex emotions combining relief, disappointment, and continued trauma. Some families express satisfaction that Jeffrey could never hurt anyone again, while others felt cheated of the opportunity to see him serve his full sentence and potentially provide additional information about their loved one's final moments. Media coverage of Jeffrey's murder reveals how his death became integrated into his broader cultural legacy, with extensive analysis of prison conditions, inmate safety, and the broader implications of institutional violence. The coverage demonstrated continued public fascination with Jeffrey's case while raising important questions about correctional system failures. The institutional investigation that followed Jeffrey's murder revealed systematic failures in prison management, inmate classification, and supervision protocols that had created conditions where violence was not just possible but inevitable. The investigation identified multiple points where different decisions might have prevented the murders. Scarver's psychological state after the murders reveals someone who viewed his actions as successful completion of a divine mission, rather than criminal behavior requiring remorse or justification. His apparent satisfaction with his actions and his continued expression of religious motivations demonstrate how mental illness can create alternative moral frameworks that justify extreme violence. The long-term psychological impact of Jeffrey's death on other high-profile inmates reveals broader implications for prison management and the safety of notorious criminals within correctional systems. His murder sent clear messages about the vulnerability of even carefully protected inmates and created ongoing security concerns for other celebrity criminals. The psychological legacy of Jeffrey's death includes questions about whether institutional violence represents justice or failure, and whether society has obligations to protect even its most despised members. These questions continue to influence discussions about correctional philosophy and the appropriate treatment of extreme criminals. Understanding the psychology of Jeffrey's final day reveals how quickly institutional stability can collapse when multiple risk factors converge. His death demonstrates the challenges faced by correctional systems in managing inmates whose crimes have created such public revulsion that they become targets for vigilante justice, even within controlled environments. The investigation into security failures that enabled Jeffrey's murder revealed how routine institutional decisions about work assignments, supervision levels, and inmate interactions can have deadly consequences when they involve high-risk individuals with histories of mental illness and violence. These findings influence subsequent reforms in prison management protocols. The timing of Jeffrey's death, occurring during what appeared to be a routine work detail, highlights how institutional violence can erupt suddenly even when protective systems seem to be functioning normally. His case demonstrates the ongoing challenges faced by correctional systems in predicting and preventing violence among inmates with severe psychological pathology. The psychological autopsy of Jeffrey's final period reveals someone who had successfully adapted to institutional life but remained vulnerable to violence from inmates whose mental illness and personal hatred created irresistible motivations for murder. His death illustrates the limits of institutional protection when dealing with individuals whose crimes have created such profound social revulsion. Scarver's continued incarceration and psychological evaluation after the murders provide ongoing insights into the mind of someone who committed institutional murder based on religious delusions and personal hatred. His case continues to influence understanding of prison violence and the management of mentally ill inmates within correctional systems. The broader implications of Jeffrey's death for correctional psychology include recognition that some inmates may always be at risk regardless of protective measures, and that institutional violence often reflects broader social attitudes about justice and punishment. His murder continues to influence discussions about how society should treat its most dangerous and despised criminals. The psychological analysis of Jeffrey's death reveals how cycles of violence can perpetuate themselves even within controlled institutional environments, and how the psychological forces that drive extreme behavior can persist and find new expressions even under maximum security conditions. His violent death represents the final chapter in a life defined by violence and psychological pathology. Understanding the complex psychology surrounding Jeffrey's murder provides crucial insights into institutional violence, the challenges of protecting high-profile inmates, and the ways that broader social attitudes about crime and punishment can influence behavior even within controlled correctional environments. His death serves as both tragedy and learning opportunity for improved prison management. The final psychological assessment of Jeffrey's institutional period reveals someone whose fundamental personality patterns persisted until his violent death, demonstrating both the consistency of severe personality disorders and their vulnerability to external violence when protective systems fail. His case provides sobering lessons about the challenges of managing extreme criminals within institutional settings. As we conclude our examination of Jeffrey's death, we see how his violent end reflected many of the same psychological themes that had characterized his entire life: violence, control, psychological pathology, and the failure of systems designed to manage dangerous individuals. His murder represents both the end of his psychological journey and a continuation of the cycles of violence that his crimes had helped perpetuate. The clinical assessment of Jeffrey Dahmer represents one of the most comprehensive forensic psychological evaluations ever conducted, involving multiple psychiatric examinations, extensive psychological testing, and expert analysis from some of the nation's leading forensic psychologists and psychiatrists. These evaluations attempted to categorize and understand his unprecedented criminal psychology through scientific frameworks that could provide insights into both his individual pathology and broader patterns of extreme criminal behavior. Dr. Frederick Fosdal's extensive psychiatric evaluation of Jeffrey revealed a diagnostic picture so complex that it challenged traditional psychiatric classification systems and required innovative clinical thinking to understand properly. His primary diagnosis of borderline personality disorder was complicated by additional features of antisocial personality disorder, necrophilia, cannibalism, and severe alcohol dependence that created a unique psychological profile rarely seen in clinical practice. The diagnostic complexity that Jeffrey presented stemmed from his pathology crossing multiple categories in ways that defied simple classification, combining elements of personality disorders, sexual deviance, substance abuse, and social dysfunction into a comprehensive psychological system that had organized his entire approach to life and relationships. This complexity made his case a landmark in forensic psychology and diagnostic assessment. Jeffrey's intellectual assessment revealed superior cognitive abilities, with an IQ measured at approximately 1 for 5, placing him in the top 2% of the population for intellectual functioning. This finding was crucial because it demonstrated that his criminal behavior wasn't the result of intellectual deficits or cognitive impairment, but rather represented the application of high intelligence to pathological purposes and criminal planning. The psychological testing battery administered to Jeffrey included comprehensive personality inventories such as the MPI-2, projective tests including the Rorschach and TAT, and specialized assessments for sexual disorders and personality pathology. These evaluations provided detailed insights into his mental state, defense mechanisms, and the psychological structures that had enabled his criminal behavior while maintaining social functioning. Clinical assessment of Jeffrey's developmental history revealed classic patterns of attachment disorder resulting from early emotional neglect, inconsistent parenting, and family dysfunction that had created fundamental impairments in his ability to form normal emotional connections with other people. Expert analysis identified these early experiences as crucial factors in developing his overwhelming need for control and his attraction to non-reciprocal relationships. The forensic evaluation of Jeffrey's sexual psychology revealed pathology that went far beyond simple paraphilia to encompass a comprehensive worldview where sexuality, death, and control had become completely intertwined in ways that made normal sexual relationships psychologically impossible for him. His necrophilia wasn't just sexual preference, but represented complex psychological solutions to fundamental emotional and attachment problems. Expert analysis of Jeffrey's cannibalistic behavior revealed psychological motivations that combined sexual gratification with deeper needs for possession, incorporation, and permanent connection with his victims. Clinical evaluation showed that his consumption of victim remains served multiple psychological functions, including sexual satisfaction, symbolic possession, and attempts to achieve the intimate connection that he couldn't obtain through normal relationships. The clinical assessment of Jeffrey's substance abuse patterns revealed how his alcohol dependence had served crucial psychological functions throughout his criminal career, including anxiety reduction, emotional numbing, and disinhibition that enabled him to commit increasingly extreme acts of violence. His drinking wasn't recreational, but was an integral component of his psychological system that made his crimes psychologically tolerable. Jeffrey's empathy assessment revealed profound deficits in his ability to experience normal human emotions or understand the suffering of others at an emotional level. While testing showed that he could intellectually recognize emotional states and even predict how others might feel, he was completely incapable of experiencing emotional resonance or genuine empathy that would have inhibited his violent behavior. The psychological evaluation of Jeffrey's fantasy life revealed elaborate internal worlds that had developed over many years and served as detailed psychological blueprints for his actual crimes. Clinical analysis showed how his fantasies weren't just sexual, but encompass complete scenarios of relationship, control, and possession that provided psychological satisfaction he couldn't achieve through normal human interaction. Expert assessment of Jeffrey's reality testing revealed intact cognitive functioning despite severe personality pathology, enabling him to understand the nature and consequences of his actions while being driven by compulsions that overcame his rational judgment. This combination of preserved cognition with impaired emotional control created the psychological conditions that made his systematic criminal behavior possible over extended periods. Clinical evaluation of Jeffrey's moral reasoning revealed sophisticated intellectual understanding of ethical principles combined with complete emotional disconnection from moral considerations when they conflicted with his psychological needs. This dissociation between intellectual and emotional moral functioning enabled him to recognize the wrongness of his actions while being unable to allow that recognition to influence his behavior. The forensic analysis of Jeffrey's criminal progression revealed patterns consistent with behavioral addiction, where each successful crime provided temporary psychological satisfaction that quickly diminished, requiring increasingly frequent and extreme behaviors to maintain psychological equilibrium. This addiction model helped experts understand how his criminal behavior had escalated so dramatically during his final period. Expert assessment of Jeffrey's social functioning revealed remarkable abilities to compartmentalize different aspects of his psychology, allowing him to present a normal facade while conducting horrific activities in private. This psychological compartmentalization enabled him to maintain employment, social relationships, and community connections while living a completely double life as an active serial killer. Clinical analysis of Jeffrey's attachment patterns revealed profound disorders that made normal emotional connections impossible while creating desperate psychological needs for control and possession that could only be satisfied through violence and complete domination. His inability to form reciprocal relationships drove him to seek one-sided connections where his partners couldn't reject, abandon, or harm him emotionally. The psychological evaluation of Jeffrey's response to treatment interventions revealed pathology so deeply ingrained and determined that conventional therapeutic approaches would have been unlikely to succeed even if they had been available during his developmental period. His case represents an extreme example of personality pathology that challenges traditional treatment models and intervention strategies. Expert analysis of Jeffrey's neurological functioning through various tests and examinations revealed no evidence of brain damage, organic pathology, or neurological abnormalities that could explain his criminal behavior. This finding emphasized that his psychology had developed through environmental, developmental, and psychological factors rather than biological abnormalities or brain dysfunction. The clinical assessment of Jeffrey's capacity for change and rehabilitation produced pessimistic prognoses from most experts, who concluded that his pathology was so fundamental to his personality structure and so resistant to modification that meaningful therapeutic change would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. This assessment influenced legal decisions about his treatment prospects and future dangerousness. Forensic evaluation of Jeffrey's violence risk assessment revealed maximum danger levels for future violent behavior if he had ever been released, based on the combination of his severe personality pathology, his extensive history of escalating violence, and his complete lack of genuine remorse or empathy for his victims. These assessments supported legal decisions about permanent incarceration and maximum security housing requirements. The expert consensus on Jeffrey's legal competency revealed someone who was fully capable of understanding legal proceedings and assisting in his defense. Despite his severe personality pathology, his intellectual abilities, reality testing, and cognitive functioning remained intact enough to meet all legal standards for competency, although his emotional functioning was severely and permanently impaired. Clinical analysis of Jeffrey's prison adaptation revealed how external structure and environmental control could enable functional behavior even in someone with severe personality disorders, suggesting that intensive external management was crucial for preventing future violence. His successful adjustment to institutional life demonstrated that appropriate environmental controls could partially compensate for his internal psychological deficits. The comprehensive personality assessment conducted on Jeffrey revealed a complex pattern of narcissistic, antisocial, and borderline features that had combined to create a unique psychological profile. His need for admiration, his lack of empathy, his identity disturbance, and his fear of abandonment all contributed to a personality structure that made normal relationships impossible while driving him toward increasingly extreme attempts to achieve control and connection. Expert evaluation of Jeffrey's sexual development revealed how his early experiences of social isolation and family dysfunction had corrupted normal psychosexual development, leading to the association of sexuality with death, control, and possession, rather than intimacy and emotional connection. This developmental distortion created the foundation for his later criminal sexual behavior. The clinical assessment of Jeffrey's cognitive distortions revealed systematic patterns of thinking that allowed him to rationalize and justify his criminal behavior while maintaining some connection to reality. His ability to reframe murder as love, killing as preservation, and violation as connection demonstrates the sophisticated psychological defenses that enabled his continued criminal activity. Jeffrey's psychological testing revealed specific patterns of response that indicated severe personality pathology combined with sophisticated defense mechanisms and impression management abilities. His test profiles showed classic patterns associated with antisocial personality disorder while also revealing the emotional emptiness and identity disturbance characteristic of borderline personality organization. Expert analysis of Jeffrey's victim selection criteria revealed systematic preferences that reflected his specific psychological needs for control, possession, and fantasy fulfillment. His targeting of young men, his preference for vulnerable individuals, and his specific approaches all demonstrated sophisticated predatory psychology that had been refined through years of criminal experience. The clinical evaluation of Jeffrey's post-offense behavior revealed patterns of psychological satisfaction and reinforcement that had driven his escalating criminal career. His detailed documentation of crimes, his preservation of victim remains, and his ongoing interaction with trophies all showed how his criminal behavior had become integrated into a comprehensive psychological system that provided multiple forms of satisfaction. Jeffrey's response to various therapeutic interventions during his incarceration revealed limited capacity for genuine insight or emotional change. Despite his intellectual understanding of his psychological problems, his cooperation with treatment providers appeared to be motivated more by attention-seeking and manipulation than by genuine desire for psychological growth or behavioral change. The expert assessment of Jeffrey's family dynamics revealed how his early experiences of emotional neglect, parental conflict, and family dysfunction had created the attachment disorders and emotional deficits that formed the foundation for his later criminal psychology. These early relational failures had profound and lasting impacts on his psychological development that proved resistant to later intervention. Clinical analysis of Jeffrey's substance use patterns revealed how alcohol had become integrated into his criminal behavior as both facilitator and coping mechanism. His drinking enabled him to overcome normal inhibitions while also providing psychological escape from the emotional consequences of his actions, creating a self-reinforcing cycle that supported continued criminal activity. The comprehensive forensic evaluation of Jeffrey Dahmer created a detailed psychological portrait that continues to influence clinical practice, legal proceedings, and research into extreme criminal behavior decades after his death. His case provides crucial insights into how multiple psychological factors can combine to create unprecedented criminal pathology while also demonstrating the limitations of current clinical knowledge in predicting and preventing such extreme cases. Understanding the expert clinical assessment of Jeffrey's psychology provides scientific validation for the psychological patterns we've identified throughout our exploration, while also revealing the sophisticated clinical thinking required to understand and categorize such complex pathology. The expert consensus demonstrates how professional psychological evaluation can illuminate even the most disturbing aspects of human behavior. The clinical legacy of Jeffrey's case continues to influence forensic psychology training, assessment protocols, and research into personality disorders and criminal behavior. His comprehensive evaluation remains a landmark in the field and continues to provide insights that inform current clinical practice and legal decision-making in cases involving extreme criminal psychology. As we conclude our examination of expert clinical assessment, we see how professional psychological evaluation confirmed and expanded upon the psychological patterns we've observed throughout our series while providing scientific framework for understanding Jeffrey's unprecedented pathology. The expert analysis validates our psychological exploration while demonstrating how clinical expertise can contribute to broader understanding of extreme criminal behavior. The psychological legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer extends far beyond his individual crimes to encompass fundamental changes in how we understand criminal psychology, conduct forensic investigations, and approach the prevention of extreme violent behavior. More than 3 decades after his arrest, Jeffrey's case continues to influence research, clinical practice, law enforcement procedures, and public policy in ways that demonstrate how even the most horrific criminal cases can contribute to broader knowledge and potentially prevent future tragedies. The impact of Jeffrey's case on serial killer research fundamentally revolutionized the field of criminal psychology, moving beyond simple behavioral classification systems to comprehensive psychological frameworks that consider developmental, environmental, biological, and social factors in their full complexity. His case became a foundational study that influenced decades of subsequent research and continues to serve as a reference point for understanding extreme criminal behavior. Jeffrey's crimes changed public understanding of serial killing in profound ways, challenging popular stereotypes of disorganized, obviously disturbed killers and demonstrating that extreme predators can appear completely normal, maintain steady employment, and function effectively in society while conducting horrific crimes. This shift in public awareness has had lasting implications for personal safety, education, and community vigilance. The psychological insights gained from studying Jeffrey's case have had major impacts on law enforcement training and investigative techniques, particularly in areas related to victimology, crime scene analysis, offender profiling, and the psychology of predatory behavior. His systematic approach to victim acquisition, crime concealment, and evidence disposal provided investigators with new frameworks for understanding how organized killers operate. Jeffrey's developmental history highlighted the crucial importance of early intervention when signs of severe psychological disturbance appear in childhood and adolescence. His progression from animal cruelty and social isolation to murder and cannibalism became a roadmap for identifying warning signs and implementing preventive interventions before pathological behavior escalates to criminal levels. The forensic science advances made during the investigation of Jeffrey's crimes contributed to significant improvements in crime scene processing, DNA analysis, chemical detection methods, and victim identification techniques that continue to benefit law enforcement investigations today. His case pushed the boundaries of what was possible in forensic science and demonstrated the importance of comprehensive physical evidence collection and analysis. Jeffrey's impact on mental health awareness and treatment approaches has been profound, particularly in areas related to personality disorders, attachment disorders, sexual pathology, and the complex intersection of mental illness with criminal behavior. His case continues to influence clinical training programs and treatment protocols for individuals with severe psychological disturbance and has contributed to better understanding of how mental illness can manifest in extreme antisocial behavior. The sociological implications of Jeffrey's case extend to broader questions about social isolation, community responsibility, urban anonymity, and the role of environmental factors in enabling criminal behavior. His ability to operate undetected in densely populated areas highlighted significant gaps in social support systems and community awareness that have influenced subsequent prevention and intervention efforts. Jeffrey's crime sparked important ongoing discussions about media responsibility, the ethics of true crime coverage, and the balance between public interest and sensationalized reporting. His case became one of the first to receive extensive media attention that raised serious questions about how extreme criminal cases should be covered and presented to the public without contributing to copycat behavior or victim exploitation. The educational impact of Jeffrey's case has been enormous across multiple disciplines, with his crimes becoming standard case studies in criminal justice programs, psychology departments, forensic science courses, and law schools worldwide. His case provides students and professionals with comprehensive examples of how psychological, environmental, and social factors can combine to create extreme criminal behavior. Jeffrey's influence on victim advocacy and support services has been significant and lasting, as the suffering experienced by his victims' families highlighted major gaps in support systems and led to important improvements in how victim families are treated during investigations, legal proceedings, and media coverage. His case contributed to broader recognition of the ongoing trauma experienced by families of violent crime victims. The policy implications of Jeffrey's case extend to numerous areas, including prison management, inmate safety protocols, the treatment of high-profile criminals within correctional systems, and the development of specialized housing units for notorious inmates. His experiences in custody and eventual murder highlighted systemic issues in prison administration that continue to influence correctional policy and practice. Jeffrey's case contributed to important legal precedents related to insanity defenses, competency evaluations, the role of mental health expert testimony in criminal proceedings, and the standards for determining criminal responsibility in cases involving severe personality disorders. His trial became a landmark case in forensic psychology and continues to influence how courts handle defendants with extreme mental illness. The international impact of Jeffrey's crimes extended far beyond the United States, influencing criminal psychology research, law enforcement training programs, and public safety awareness initiatives in countries worldwide. His case became a global reference point for understanding extreme criminal behavior and continues to inform international cooperation in criminal investigations. Jeffrey's influence on popular culture and public discourse about crime has been profound and enduring, making him one of the most recognized criminal figures in modern history, while also contributing to broader public understanding of psychology, mental illness, and the factors that contribute to criminal behavior. His case continues to generate discussion, analysis, and cultural commentary decades after his death. The research opportunities created by Jeffrey's case have led to numerous academic studies examining various aspects of his psychology, criminal behavior, family dynamics, and the social factors that contributed to his development. These studies continue to produce insights that influence both academic understanding and practical applications in criminal justice, mental health treatment, and prevention programming. Jeffrey's case highlighted the critical importance of interagency cooperation and information sharing in criminal investigations, as his ability to operate across different jurisdictions and victim populations demonstrated the need for coordinated law enforcement responses to mobile predators. These lessons continue to influence multi-jurisdictional investigation protocols and information sharing systems. The technological advances prompted by Jeffrey's case include significant improvements in DNA analysis capabilities, chemical detection methods, digital forensics, and database systems that have broad applications extending far beyond serial killer investigations. His case pushed technological boundaries and contributed to advances that benefit all types of criminal investigations and forensic analysis. Jeffrey's impact on professional training extends well beyond law enforcement and mental health professionals to include emergency responders, social workers, educators, and other professionals who might encounter individuals with severe psychological disturbance. His case provides important lessons about recognizing warning signs, implementing appropriate interventions, and understanding the progression of psychological pathology. The prevention implications of Jeffrey's case are perhaps its most important legacy, as understanding his psychological development provides crucial insights into how similar pathology might be identified and addressed before it leads to criminal behavior. His case continues to inform prevention strategies, early intervention programs, and risk assessment protocols designed to identify potentially dangerous individuals. Understanding Jeffrey's influence on public safety awareness reveals how his crimes contributed to increased vigilance about predatory behavior, improved public education about personal safety, and better understanding of how predators select and approach victims. His case helped people understand that extreme predators don't always fit obvious stereotypes and can appear trustworthy and normal. The ethical questions raised by Jeffrey's case continue to influence ongoing discussions about criminal responsibility, the role of mental illness in violent crime, society's obligations to prevent crime while protecting individual rights, and the appropriate balance between public safety and individual privacy. His case provides ongoing frameworks for examining these complex moral and legal questions. Jeffrey's contribution to understanding the relationship between childhood trauma and adult criminal behavior has been invaluable, providing detailed documentation of how early experiences of neglect, abuse, and family dysfunction can influence psychological development in ways that have devastating long-term consequences. His case continues to inform trauma research and prevention efforts. The long-term social impact of Jeffrey's crimes includes lasting changes in how communities approach safety concerns, particularly in urban environments where anonymity can enable predatory behavior. His case contributed to increased awareness of the importance of community connections and social support systems in preventing social isolation that can contribute to criminal development. Jeffrey's influence on scientific understanding of extreme human behavior extends beyond criminal psychology to encompass broader questions about human nature, the capacity for evil, environmental influences on behavior, and the factors that can corrupt normal psychological development. His case provides crucial data for understanding the darkest aspects of human psychology and behavior. The technological legacy of Jeffrey's case includes contributions to database development, forensic analysis techniques, and investigative protocols that continue to solve crimes and identify perpetrators decades after his death. His case demonstrated the importance of comprehensive evidence collection and systematic analysis that has influenced standard procedures in criminal investigations. Understanding the institutional changes prompted by Jeffrey's case reveals how his crimes influence policies and procedures in numerous organizations, including law enforcement agencies, mental health facilities, correctional institutions, and educational systems. his case became a catalyst for systematic reviews and improvements in how institutions handle individuals with severe psychological problems. Jeffrey's impact on risk assessment and threat evaluation procedures has been significant, with his case contributing to improved understanding of how to identify and evaluate individuals who may pose extreme dangers to public safety. His developmental history and criminal progression provide frameworks for assessing risk factors and implementing appropriate monitoring and intervention strategies. The legacy of family impact from Jeffrey's case includes ongoing recognition of how criminal behavior affects not just direct victims, but extends to family members, communities, and society as a whole. His case highlighted the need for comprehensive support systems that address the broad range of individuals affected by extreme criminal behavior. Jeffrey's influence on academic research extends across multiple disciplines, including psychology, criminology, sociology, forensic science, and law, with his case continuing to generate scholarly investigation and analysis that contributes to broader understanding of human behavior and criminal justice issues. His case remains one of the most studied in criminal psychology. Understanding the prevention lessons learned from Jeffrey's case provides hope that his victims' deaths contribute to ongoing efforts to identify, understand, and prevent similar cases from developing. The knowledge gained from studying his psychology continues to inform efforts to recognize warning signs and implement interventions before psychological problems escalate to criminal behavior. The comprehensive examination we've conducted throughout this series reveals Jeffrey Dahmer as one of criminal history's most instructive cases, providing insights that continue to influence research, practice, and prevention efforts decades after his death. His psychological journey from troubled child to serial killer provides crucial understanding of how extreme pathology develops and potentially can be prevented through early identification and intervention. Jeffrey's case demonstrates how even the most horrific criminal behavior can contribute to broader human understanding and potentially prevent future tragedies when studied systematically and comprehensively. His legacy includes both the horror of his crimes and the knowledge gained from understanding his psychology that continues to protect potential victims and inform prevention efforts. The lasting impact of Jeffrey's case on multiple fields of study and practice ensures that his victims' deaths continue to serve broader purposes of understanding, prevention, and protection. His psychological legacy represents both a sobering reminder of human capacity for evil and a source of knowledge that continues to contribute to efforts to understand, predict, and prevent extreme criminal behavior. As we conclude our comprehensive psychological exploration of Jeffrey Dahmer, we're left with the recognition that understanding such extreme cases is crucial for protecting society while honoring the memory of victims by ensuring that their deaths contribute to broader efforts to prevent similar tragedies. The lessons learned from his case continue to influence how we approach criminal psychology, investigate extreme crimes, and work to prevent future violence. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer represents one of criminal psychology's most important and comprehensive case studies, demonstrating how detailed psychological analysis can illuminate even the darkest corners of human behavior while contributing to ongoing efforts to understand, predict, and prevent extreme violence. His case remains a touchstone for criminal psychology research and practice, ensuring that the horror of his crimes continues to serve the broader purposes of knowledge, understanding, and prevention that may help protect future potential victims.